Hello and welcome to what we have been calling QuEn 2023, a meeting of QBism and Enactivism. My name is Hanne De Jaegher. I am a science writer, and I am thrilled to get to facilitate this conversation between Fuchs, Ezequiel Di Paolo, and Hanne De Jaegher about connections between the QBist approach to quantum mechanics and the enactive approach to cognitive science. Ezequiel Di Paolo is a research professor at Ikerbasque, the Basque Science Foundation in San Sebastian, Spain. And he's one of the leading researchers in the field of enactive and embodied cognition. Hanne De Jaegher is a philosopher and cognitive scientist at the University of the Basque Country, also in San Sebastian, but she's joining us today from Vancouver, where she is a Wall Scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Together, Ezequiel and Hanne developed the enactive approach to intersubjectivity, known as participatory sensemaking, and they co-authored, along with Elena Kufari, an amazing book called The Linguistic Bodies. Fuchs is a physicist at UMass Boston. He's joining us today from Boulder, Colorado, where he's a visiting fellow at GILA. And Chris is the leading proponent, as well as one of the originators of the interpretation of quantum mechanics, formerly known as quantum Bayesianism, and now known as QBism. So what I'm going to do is just quickly set up some points of contact between these two fields, like why we're having this conversation. And then I will turn it over to Chris to talk about QBism and to Ezequiel and Hanne to talk about Enaction, and then we'll have just like an open discussion. So I'm hopeful that this is the start of a larger conversation between the communities of people working in quantum foundations and people working in enactive and 4E cognitive science. Okay, so since Chris is going to explain what QBism is and Hanne and Ezequiel will explain what Enaction is, I thought I would just set things up by saying what they are not. So in most approaches to quantum mechanics, you have something called a quantum state or a wave function, and that is taken to represent the state of affairs of the world. So you can have like a wave function that represents a cat that's dead and alive, and then an observer makes a measurement, and somehow only one of those outcomes is realized, and the wave function is said to collapse. So QBism is not that. It is not the idea that quantum states are objective representations of an observer-independent reality. And then in cognition, the typical approach is to say the mind is in the head, the mind reduces to the workings of the brain, and that what the brain is fundamentally doing is forming internal representations of the world and then performing computations over those representations. And enactive cognitive science is not that. It is not the idea that the mind is in the head. So, okay. So in QBism, the wave function doesn't represent the world. In the enactive approach, the brain doesn't represent the world. And those might seem like unrelated things, like they just happen to reject the same word. But I do think they come from a common root, because to represent something, you have to be able to draw like a definitive, unambiguous line between subject and object, between the thing that's representing and the thing that's being represented. And in both QBism and the enactive approach, that boundary is constantly being renegotiated in profound ways. So that brings me to some possible points of contact between QBism and Enaction. I should say I'm using the terms Enaction and Enactivism sort of interchangeably, but I apologize if I'm not using the preferred word. And I also actually want to address, before I list the points of contact, just the fact that this is like a conversation about quantum mechanics and the mind. And typically when you put those terms together in the same sentence, people get nervous, like you're about to veer into sort of woo-woo territory. And I just want to say that I think the origin of the woo-woo in those situations is the assumption of like a realist hidden variable type of interpretation of quantum mechanics, where the wave function is taken to represent the state of affairs of the world, or it comes from the assumption of a representationalist view of the mind, or most often, I think it's really coming from putting both of those things together. Because if you ask things like when people ask, do quantum measurements require conscious observers? Can consciousness collapse wave functions? They're sort of implicitly taking a cognitivist view of consciousness where consciousness is something passive in the head, and then they're taking the wave function to be something out there in the world that can collapse. And obviously, if you think something in the head that's passive reaches out and collapses something in the world, that's like, that whole story is going to be problematic. So to put it another way, like if you make the assumption that this subject-object boundary is fixed, then any suggestion you make of like one thing crossing that divide is going to entail some kind of magic. But the first point of contact between QBism and enactivism is that they both reject this idea of a fixed subject-object split. I liked that Bohr points out here that that the fixed boundary was the whole basis of mechanistic physics, and it's what quantum mechanics would undo.
Is that an actual quote of Bohr?
Yeah.
Or is it a paraphrase?
No, that's an actual quote.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's awfully pithy for Bohr.
Yeah, I think it was a little longer and I shortened it, but that is.
Oh, it is a paraphrase then.
Well, there should be an ellipse at the end, so let's put it that way.
Okay.
But he was like saying it in contrast to quantum mechanics. And yeah, so this subject-object split comes to us from Descartes. Descartes specifically imposed that boundary so he could develop a mechanistic physics. And then that sort of automatically left the mind, or the cogito, on the other side of that divide. And so by imposing this like fixed boundary, Descartes sort of created classical physics and cognitive science in one fell swoop, because his mechanistic physics like eventually became Newtonian physics, and then his cogito has sort of become representationalist cognitive science. So with QBism and enactive cognition, like challenging each side of that divide and challenging like the division itself, I think that opens the door to potentially fruitful and woo-woo free conversations about quantum physics and philosophy of mind. Okay, so a few more points of contact. QBism and Enaction drink from the same philosophical fountains, namely pragmatism and phenomenology. So QBism is like foundationally influenced by William James, John Dewey, and the early American pragmatists, and is now finding resonances in phenomenology and in thinkers like Merleau-Ponty. And Enaction is foundationally influenced by Merleau-Ponty, but is now finding resonances in the early American pragmatists. So it's probably not a coincidence that QBism and Enaction share the same kind of philosophical temperament. And of course, what pragmatism and phenomenology and these philosophers all have in common is exactly that rejection of subject-object dualism, where you have like passive subjects pitted against a world of pre-existing objects. And instead they focus on an active, participatory being in and of and with the world. So as Merleau-Ponty puts it, the relations between reality and measurement must be conceived outside the dichotomy of in itself and representation. And I think this applies equally to QBism and to Enaction. And so what all of this amounts to is that for QBism, the world is dynamic, unfinished, and continuously shaped and reshaped in participation with the agent or the observer. And for enactivism, the agent is dynamic, unfinished, and continuously shaped and reshaped in participation with the world. So that's enough for me. That hopefully kind of sets some of the terms of the conversation, but we'll just hear about what QBism is, what Enaction is, and then we can sort of come back to some of these points. So I will turn it over to Chris.
With that kind of introduction, I really don't have anything else to say. That worries me. So on the one hand, I've got nothing to say, and on the other hand, I have a gazillion slides. I'm basing this on a talk that I gave in Helsinki at some consciousness conference earlier, I guess last summer. And anyway, this was the title then, and I'll use it as my title now, Cubism and Pure Experience. The piece of art on the left is called Nude Descending a Staircase number 2. And if you show it to anyone who knows something about art, they say, well, that's not Cubism. That's, I guess, futurism or something like this. And I love this quote that I found on the web before its first presentation at the 1912 Salon des Indépendants. I can't, it's underneath my screen. It was rejected by the QBists as being too futurist. And I use this as a warning that parts of this talk would probably be rejected by my fellow QBists because we haven't really all come to agreement on exactly where we want to go with an ontology for QBism, but ontology in an unusual sense. We all have the sense that it's going to be an unusual thing. It's not going to be the standard philosophy of physics ontology where the wave function is either this kind of property or that kind of property or the other kind of property, but it's always the wave function. So for us, it'll never be the wave function. But the question is, the question I think is, it was a nice little essay by Adam Frank that I sent to Amanda last week, where he had a really nice formulation of how the physicists should answer when they're questioned on, don't you believe in a world? And his reply was something like, of course there's a world when no one's around. It's just not this one. And so anyway, here we go. What is QBism? Amanda alluded to the fact that QBism used to be a shortening of the terms quantum and Bayesian. And the origin of that is that, in 1993, Carlton Caves, Rudiger Schock, and I got together and started thinking about how we could understand quantum probabilities as Bayesian probabilities. Quantum probabilities are the probabilities that are given when you practice quantum mechanics. Bayesian probabilities, on the other hand, are understood as quantified degrees of belief. Physicists were in the habit of thinking quantum probabilities must be objective probabilities. They must be properties of things in the world, whereas the Bayesian notion says, no, probability theory doesn't have to do with properties of the world. It has to do with living beings in the world trying to make better decisions. So we tried to see if we could make this idea work. And the very first paper, after sort of brewing for 9 years, was this one from 2002. And we became known as quantum Bayesians. But as we tried to push the conception, as we tried to make sure that the conception was absolutely airtight, consistent, we found that we were being pushed in a direction in the spectrum of Bayesians. So there's not just one kind of Bayesian, there's at least 46,000 different kinds of Bayesians. Why is my own hand up? It's as if I wanted to ask a question. You guys see that on my screen? You do? Huh. Well, it's maybe just going to have to stay up because I don't see how to take it down. Okay, let me reshare screen. Okay, it is what it is. Yes, so a difficulty arose that we were taking, we were sort of forced into the radical end of Bayesianism, something called subjective Bayesianism, where there's really no constraints whatsoever in the world that make probabilities right or wrong. We became followers of this man, Bruno Di Finetti, who writes in the introduction to his book, my thesis, paradoxically and a little provocatively, but nonetheless genuinely, is simply this: probability does not exist. And what he meant by that was, of course, probability exists as a useful tool, but it doesn't exist as something out in the world. That's too radical for most Bayesians. And so we had lots of tomatoes thrown at us because they would say, you're no Bayesian. So we knew that we had to jettison the term. And so QBism sort of took on an identity of its own. Like I often say, Kentucky Fried Chicken used to be the official name of the corporation. Now it's simply KFC. QBism just became QBism. But in fact, just a few years ago, I ran across a quote in the correspondence of Oliver Wendell Holmes, where he said something that just really struck my fancy. Chauncey Wright, a nearly forgotten philosopher of real merit, taught me when young that I must not say necessary about the universe, that we don't know whether anything is necessary or not. So I describe myself as a bet-abilitarian. I believe that we can bet on the behavior of the universe in its contact with us. And when I saw that, I thought, God, it's got all of the right ingredients. Probabilities are about gambling commitments in the subjective Bayesian view. And what we're gambling on in QBism is not what's out in the world. We're not gambling on what's true out there, what's false, but rather we're gambling on the universe's contact with us and our experiences in that universe. So I briefly thought about calling it quantum betabilitarianism, but that's such an ugly term. I've gone back to the idea that QBism is just QBism. It's meant to be a magic pistol for quantum conundrums. We believe it wipes out all of the existing quantum conundrums that one hears debated ad infinitum at the philosophy of physics meetings, but also it's meant to be a basis for new physical questions and new physics, one of which is the ontology, but other things about how to best work out the formalism. Believe it or not, on April 1st of last year, I gave a talk at a meeting about Buddhism and quantum mechanics, and I titled it QBism for Buddhism. And I found two QBist depictions of the Buddha that I used in that talk. And since I was at a meeting on Buddhism, I thought I should have my own eightfold path. And I tabulated 8 tenets of QBism. For instance, that a quantum state is an agent's personal judgment, like Amanda has already told us. Amanda hasn't told us yet, but I'll talk about it in some length. A quantum measurement is an agent's action upon the external world and so forth. So there are 8 tenets. And just like with the eightfold path, the reason for the tenets is that they're prescription to relieve the suffering. So QBism is founded on these tenets in an attempt to shut down all the misery that philosophers of physics feel. It would be nice to talk about all of those. I'm not going to today. But since we have an eightfold path, we should recognize that we're still in search of our noble truth. I'm not going to go so far as saying that there should be 4 noble truths, but there might be at least one noble truth, and that is, what is the ontology underlying QBism? So at the very end of this presentation, I'll give some remarks about that. Probably the best metaphor for capturing what QBism is about is to take this book by Leonard Savage. It was The Foundations of Statistics. It was the first book that really laid out all of the details of decision theory, how to make better decisions in the face of just being in the world. So it gives a prescription for how to gamble if you must. When you adopt this book and you start using it, no one I imagine, would ever feel the need to say, oh, you're worried about making your own decisions, then that must mean you don't believe in an external world. No, I'm worried about making good decisions precisely because I'm living in an external world. But that book is only about how you're gambling. So you must be a solipsist in some way. Once again, no, there's no implication of that. It's a manual. So QBism views the formal rules of quantum theory as an addition to that book, not something in spite of the book, but just an addition. There might, for instance, if we go back to the book, there might have, in a second edition, if Savage had lived long enough, he might have added an appendix, special considerations for making decisions in love and marriage. It's Appendix A. Appendix B might be special considerations for making decisions in the economic forum. And Appendix C might have been special considerations for making decisions in your interactions with the quantum world. That's the way QBism views quantum mechanics. So I said we adopted Bruno Di Finetti's paradigm of probability. Di Finetti's paradigm is egocentric. It's about the single agent. It's a tale of a single person contemplating the world and not wanting to be stupid. He realized that to do this, his statements of uncertainties must satisfy the laws of probability theory. So it's, from the point of view of Di Finetti, the more basic thing is the idea of not wanting to be stupid. And he gives a criterion for being stupid. And then from that comes the structure of probability theory. So usually when you teach probability theory to students, you open up the textbook and it tells you what probability is, and it gives some axioms for what counts as a probability, but it doesn't tell you where it comes from. The paradigm for Di Finetti is that what we're really talking about are gambling commitments. And gambling commitments may or may not have the structure of probabilities. Laser pointer. So here's the setup, and I'll just go through it briefly. We have a bookie and we have a gambler, and the bookie has these prices listed. The prices are prices for lottery tickets. So for instance, a lottery ticket of this variety worth $1 if event E occurs. The gambler is willing to buy or sell one of those lottery tickets for this many dollars. There might be another lottery ticket that he's willing to buy or sell, worth $1 if not E. He's willing to buy or sell that for this amount of money, P sub not E. There might be another ticket worth $1 if E or F. And he'd be willing to buy or sell the ticket with this price and so forth. So the bookie puts prices up, and he says, look, if you bring me a lottery ticket and you pay me this much money, I'll take it. Or if you come up to me and you say you want to buy a lottery ticket, I'll sell it to you for this price. That's kind of the game. There's nothing implied in this story about probabilities, that these numbers are probabilities. Di Finetti had the great realization that if you add one rule, basically the not being stupid rule, normative rule, the bookie should never declare numbers that will lead to a sure loss. In other words, that the bookie will lose money no matter what happens. If the bookie has adjusted all the prices so that he might lose money or he might not lose money, but it definitely won't be the case that he will absolutely lose money, then it turns out that these prices have to satisfy all of the axioms of probability theory. So that's the paradigm for thinking for QBism. I call this a normative reading of probability theory. The reason for that is, in any real-world application, you might get your gambling commitments for E or F by studying, let's say, the Boston Globe. And you might get your commitments for this, what you'd be willing to buy these lottery tickets from reading whatever your newspaper is in the Basque country, and so forth. So these gambling estimates or gambling commitments may come from all different sorts of sources. Because, for instance, you find one newspaper is really good about its estimates of F, and another newspaper is really good about its estimates of E, and so forth. So you would like to pick and choose all of your probabilities from these different sources. What Di Finetti's rule says is they had better fit together according to this, or you expose yourself to a sure loss, or if we think in biological terms, you expose yourself to sure death if you don't satisfy these things. To make the probabilities fit, it often involves the will. So there's an element of voluntarism in the terms of Bas van Frossen, and well, in terms of Bas van Frossen, but it's basically William James's will to believe argument. Sometimes you have to smash these things down so that they all fit together. And you don't have any other source other than your will to do that. Now, when I show a diagram like this, people go, look, subjective, subjective, subjective. There's no objectivity anywhere. But actually there is objectivity. It's in the norm itself. It's third person, it's invariant. It doesn't depend upon the particular agents. Okay, so that's the conception of probability that QBism works with. QBism views quantum theory as supplying extra normative rules to probability theory. So I told you it's Appendix C in our imaginary second edition of Savage's book. Can you imagine having the name Savage? I would like, actually it would fit my beard better. Maybe I'll change my name. All right, it gives the motivation here. I'm not expecting you to understand this equation, but this is one of the most basic equations in quantum theory. The first version of it was written down by Max Born. This is a kind of generalized version of it. But let me just tell you what the ingredients are. The ingredients on the right-hand side is something called a quantum state. Like Amanda said, it might be the state that says cat is live plus dead. And the other ingredient on the right side is an expression of what's being measured. It's called a measurement operator. And you put these two ingredients, the quantum state and the measurement operator, together, and then from that you get the probability for the outcome. QBism would like to view this equation in normative terms, just like with probability theory, but there's something that immediately gets in the way. The thing that immediately gets in the way is that on the left side, indeed, we've got probabilities, but on the right side, we've got things that don't appear to be probabilities. They appear to be different things with perhaps a different ontological status. You might say, well, the thing on the left is really epistemic. It's about knowledge or belief, but the things on the right are about states of reality. So that seems to get in the way. Whereas in the normative rules that we saw in the Di Finetti game, we've got probabilities on the left and we've got probabilities on the right. So what we would like to do, being Bayesians or QBists, is find some way of expressing this so that it hits you over the head. Oh, this is a normative rule as well. And the way to go about that is to try to find a way of expressing this that only has probabilities on the left and probabilities on the right, just as before. The essential hint came from Richard Feynman in a 1951 paper titled The Concept of Probability in Quantum Theory. The new theory asserts that there are experiments for which the exact outcome is fundamentally unpredictable, and that in these cases, one has to be satisfied with computing probabilities. But far more fundamental was the discovery that in nature, the laws of combining probabilities were not those of the classical theory of Laplace. So now we're deeply into the technical program of QBism. It's the part of QBism that allows me to come to places like Jilla and not be laughed out of the room by the physicists. On the other hand, it's the part that usually puts philosophers to sleep. So maybe I'll go over this very quickly, but here's the key thing that I want to say. Far more fundamental is that quantum mechanics tells you that you should combine probabilities in a different way. So when we want to reinterpret this thing, we're going to find it an expression of how to combine probabilities, but it won't be the thing that we saw from Diffinetti's Dutch book argument. I'm going to skip the apparatus. Well, let me just say this much. You can draw a little diagram of one experiment. And I won't tell you too much about this experiment other than it introduces something called a reference measuring device. And then there's a more general measurement. The reference device you can either turn on or turn off. Turning it on, this whole thing represents one experiment. If you turn it off, it represents a distinct experiment. So there's some details about that. But here's what we find. If we look at the probabilities, let's go back. Sorry, Amanda, I wasn't prepared for this part. If we look at this experiment with the switch on, then we've got these various probabilities that you see here. Probabilities for the outcome of this device, the probabilities for the outcome of this device, and the conditional probabilities of this device given this device. So there's three sets of probabilities in this story when the switch is turned on. When the switch is turned off, the quantum system goes through this device, it's never measured, and there are probabilities for the outcomes of this device. We get those probabilities by using the normal rules of quantum mechanics. But it turns out that there's a relation between the two experiments, the one where the switch is turned on and the one where the switch is turned off. And that relation turns out to be this little kind of equation here. The probabilities for the outcomes when the switch is turned off are determined by the probabilities for the various outcomes when the switches are turned on, but you don't get the classical law relating things. So here's what we have. If it were the classical world, this extra little term in the middle would be the identity. It would just be the number one. But in the quantum world, there's something extra there. But the key thing to think about is this gives us a way of viewing the Born rule in normative terms. We see that it's a relation. The Born rule is a relation between probabilities on the left and probabilities on the right. It's just not the relation that we would have expected from quantum theory, from classical probability theory. The old equation is still visible in this because it turns out that this set of probabilities is a complete representation of the quantum state. And this set of probabilities is a complete representation of the measurement operators. But what this has made clear is those things called quantum states and measurement operators are actually of the same character as probabilities. It was just always hidden all along. We want to give a normative reading just like before. It may be that your estimates for all of these things come from different sources. And the way to think of quantum theory is that it's a criterion that tells you whether you've made a bad move, whether you expose yourself to sure death. Subjective, subjective, subjective. scares physicists because physicists think quantum theory has to be about the objective world. But not everything is subjective. The norm itself is objective. Just as before, third personal, invariant. We can fight over the right term to use. Maybe I shouldn't use the word objective, but it's something that's common to all observers. Okay, let's move in the direction of enactivism now. I told you that this term that I'm circling is a complete representation of the measurement operators. So just looking at that mathematical expression, you know the measurement. But on the other hand, it's a probability understood from the Bayesian direction. So what that tells us, what we learn from that, Niels Bohr was accustomed to drawing measuring devices in his paper as big, solid objects that are bolted firmly to laboratory tables. And in that sense, for Bohr, they were objective. They're solid, heavy objects. From the point of view of QBism, well, this solid, heavy object is nothing other than a conditional probability assignment. And conditional probability assignments are tools by agents to use. They're not solid, heavy objects out in the world. Conceptually, then, from the view of QBism, the lab equipment is part of the, what word do I have there? The agent. It was buried. So whereas in many developments of quantum mechanics, there's the external world, there's the quantum system that's living in it, then there's the measuring device, and then there is the observer looking at the measuring device. In QBism, it's just the single split of external world and agent. And all of this fancy stuff in the laboratory is just an extension of the agent. The key idea that we have been working on in my group is trying to squeeze this expression to squeeze from it what we can say about the world. Okay, let me go down a different tack. How long have I been talking? Not too terribly long. Let me go a little further. If that's okay with everybody, or are there any questions right now before I go into a different direction?
No.
Ezekiel?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the next thing I want to analyze is, what are these probabilities about? I've already hinted what they're about, but let me just make it clear. The probabilities might have been about pre-existing but unknown things out in the world. You know, for instance, when you open up the door and you see the cat, either alive or dead, your probabilities might have been about some actual property in the world. The cat is alive, the cat is dead, and I just don't know it. Or another option is that the probabilities are about experiences, straight up. So for instance, when I write down the probability of opening the door and seeing cat alive, that's an experience. Opening the door, seeing cat dead, that's a different experience. And maybe I'm only gambling on that. This, I would say, is the positive contribution of the no-go theorems that you guys are probably not so familiar with, but there are things called Bell inequality violations and Cochin-Specker non-coloring things, and the QC-Barrett-Rudolph PBR theorem. These are all called no-go theorems. I think this is the positive contribution of those no-go theorems. They actually answer this question for us. And I'm going to focus on one quickly, the one due to John Bell. John Bell thought that his theorem in combination with experiments showed that I can pick my nose over here in Boulder and somehow magically that affects your life in the Basque Country. In other words, that there's instantaneous action at a distance. He thought that his theorem showed that. But from the point of view of QBism, it shows something completely different. It hinges on whether one accepts or not something called the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen criterion of reality. The criterion of reality in their paper says, if without in any way disturbing a system, we can predict with certainty, with probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity. So if we can predict with probability 1 without even touching a system, we can predict with probability 1 what we'll see without having touched it before, then there exists an element of reality corresponding to that quantity. It's very popular in philosophy of physics. Almost no one questions this criterion. But let's think about what it would mean from the point of view of QBism. What means probability 1 in QBism? Well, it means that you would buy or sell a lottery ticket that's worth $1 if the event occurs, for in fact $1, full stop. That's all it means. Probability 1 does not imply truth or existence. So you can see, going back here, probability 1 would not imply the existence of an element of reality. A philosopher of science, Richard Jeffrey, said it very nicely. He said 0 and 1 are probabilities no less than 1/2 and 99 100ths are. All 0 or 1 means is that you would stake your all on it. So let us go to what is considered the clearest exposition of the Bell argument by Tim Maudlin in a paper titled What Bell Said or What Bell Did. I've forgotten which one. He says, if I could make one change to the EPR paper, it would be to alter the characterization of this criterion. The criterion is, in the parlance of philosophers, analytic. It follows just from the very meanings of the words. Well, that's not so for QBism, because in fact, the words have different meanings in QBism. So that kills the EPR criterion of reality. And then that frees us up to understanding what the other theorems are telling us. And QBism says this: the violation of the Bell inequalities don't prove that nature is non-local. Rather, they demonstrate that nature is creative. When a measurement is performed, it doesn't reveal a pre-existing outcome. Here's the way I wrote it in a paper once. With every quantum measurement by an experimenter's free will, the world is shaped just a little as it takes part in a moment of creation. So too it is with every action of every agent everywhere, not just experimentalists in the laboratories. And I would be curious to know whether that is kind of a part of enactivism or whether it's not, that sentence. So too it is with every action of every agent everywhere, not just quantum experimentalists in laboratories. Quantum measurements represent those moments of creation that are sought out or noticed, that in the Jamesian term, that one pays attention to, or that one turns one's attention to. So here's a kind of picture of the QBist view of quantum theory. And I'm posing this as a self-check problem just to make sure you understand the point of view. This fellow is Captain QBism, because every movement needs a superhero. I hope Enactivism has one. And Captain QBism can take actions on the world external to himself. That's what this little cube is to represent. In quantum theory, a measurement is understood as an action. Or in QBism, measurement is understood as the agent taking an action on a system, and consequent to the action that the agent has taken on a system, it leads to a new experience for the agent. The quantum state is something off to the side here, or I might put it up next to the head of the agent. This thing is a mathematical tool for helping the agent to make predictions about the experiences he will receive upon taking the action. Or better yet, it's not just about making better predictions. The quantum state helps inform him to decide whether he wants to take one action or another action. So it helps in his decision making. All right, so here's the self-check. I want to play the game that I've taken an eraser and I start erasing part of this diagram. So I start erasing the diagram. I've erased some of it. I'm careful here not to erase this. I'm just erasing the agent out of the diagram. And now let me ask the following question. If I erase the agent out of the diagram, according to QBism, what happens to the quantum state over here on the side? Hanne, do you want to take a guess?
We can't know what happens to it.
We can't know what happens to it? Okay. Ezequiel, you want to take a guess? We've erased the agent.
Yes, from what you've been saying, the state would also be erased because there is no nobody's betting on anything. The agent is gone.
That's right. So when you erase the agent, the quantum state goes poof. It's gone. So the quantum state is not part of the world. If by chance, by small chance, the Earth were the only planet with intelligent life, then there was never a quantum state in the universe before 1926. And then after that, there were some quantum states, but I don't think I ever wrote down a real quantum state until I was in my 30s. So, okay, so good, you passed the test.
Can I say
now
something?
Notice, yeah, please.
The reason why I said we can't know is because I think there isn't just this one agent and everybody are these agents. And so, but anyway, that was the...
I see.
Maybe we come to that later.
Oh, well, no, that's a very good point. Let me just emphasize that QBism is, like in one of the quotes early on, it's an egocentric story. So a quantum state is always tagged to an agent. And for instance, if along with Captain QBism, we had what would be a good name? So in the old days, there was Captain Marvel and there was Miss Marvel. So if Miss Marvel were to come up and write down a quantum state, there's no necessity that she would write down the same quantum state for this system that this fellow would. So in QBism, everything, it's always an egocentric story for the quantum formalism, for use of the quantum formalism. But then there are the invariant parts, and those are the normative rules. But that's a very good point, and yeah, we should come back to that. All right, there's another thing that I would claim stays behind when we erase the agent, and that is the normative relation itself stays behind. What it represents is if we drop an agent back into the world, like in Adam Frank's thing, there is a world, it's just not this one. Well, at least it is prepared for an agent to this extent. This normative agent is, this normative relation is just waiting for the terms to be dropped into it. But without an agent, there's nothing dropped into it. It's just kind of latent. It's a latent thing in the universe. To some extent, I think this sounds a little like J.S. Mill's cashing out of an object's existence as a permanent possibility of experience. There may or may not be a similarity, and I've been wanting to talk to philosophers who know something about Mill about that. So here, let me put the way QBism, I think, sees the sort of radical creative nature. So this is something from another paper. There's a sense in which this unhinging of the Born rule from being a law of nature makes the QBist notion of quantum indeterminism a far more radical variety than anything proposed in the quantum debate before. It says in the end that nature does what it wants without a mechanism underneath and without a hidden hand and these other sort of half-baked notions of philosophers, or indeed any conception that would diminish the autonomy of nature's events. Nature and its parts do what they want, and we as free-willed agents do what we can get away with. Quantum theory on this account is our best means yet for hitching a ride with the universe's pervasive creativity and doing what we can to contribute to it. So whence the noble truths? Believe it or not, we have the progenitor of what I think is the best expression yet of this. It wasn't John Wheeler, who was one of my heroes, and I think one of Amanda's heroes, but I think it was Amanda herself who pointed us in the probably the best. How do I want to formulate this? I'm sorry, Amanda. I hope I'm not embarrassing you. I'm going to show you something that Amanda showed us in around 2017 in South Africa. And as she was presenting it, my jaw just dropped. And one of my students, his jaw dropped as well, because we thought it was the clearest expression of what we'd been seeking for a long time. So Amanda took John Wheeler's famous eyeball. So John Wheeler, this was his representation of the universe. There was the Big Bang, and out of the Big Bang develops observers. And Wheeler had the idea that there was this action back on the Big Bang across time, that that these observers now participated in making the Big Bang billions of years ago. So Amanda's diagram, it's more like there's an observer in the forest, and we're going to ask the old question of if a tree falls in the forest, does the observer hear it? So Amanda says, let me move my, so I can read this. You have a subject and an object, and mostly they seem like separate things. But when you look closely enough, you find that they are conjoined, that there's this piece of connective tissue where they can't be pulled apart, because within that region, there's no way to say which is which. The discreteness we find in quantum mechanics is not a property of the object, it's a property of the subject-object relation. I think a useful way of thinking about this is to see Planck's quantum of action as a kind of coupling constant between subject and object, between observer and observed. As you turn the strength of that coupling down, the area of overlap gets smaller and smaller. And if you turn it all the way down to zero, observer and observed can be neatly separated. It recovers classical physics, and it frees the object from its subject so that it can be shared by other subjects. So if we were to turn Planck's constant all the way to zero, we would be left with classical physics instead of quantum physics. And when we break the connective tissue completely, then now we can have a view of the world in which there's the one object and all of the different agents, and there's no connective tissue between these things and these things. But of course, H, the Planck constant, by the way, someone just told me recently, I'd never heard this before. The reason it's called H is because the German word for help also starts with an H. And Planck thought of this quantity as a helper, so he denoted it H. But of course, H is not zero. And so we have to contend with the irreducible coupling between subject and object that, and I'm going to throw this in, that QBism says is the very essence of quantum physics. So I think this points us in the direction of a certain set of philosophies for exploring the idea that this is the fundamental thing that's going on. The candidates for the ontology, in my mind, since I'm not a philosopher, I'm willing to play the game with any philosophical school that will play, is it might be James's pure experience, or it might be Whitehead's actual occasions, or it might be Dewey and Bentley. Very late Dewey decided that the word experience was too loaded with humanistic connotations. So he changed the word to transaction. It might be Merleau-Ponty's flesh or chiasm, or Karen Barad's interaction, or Mach's world elements. So the ontology that we're seeking, I think, is somewhere of the flavor of those various philosophies. But none of these, I suspect, none of these depend upon the exact insights earned by quantum theory. And what we have with quantum theory is an opportunity to readdress these kinds of philosophies and ask what quantum theory might contribute and help refine these notions. I don't need to quote James. So here's what we need to seek: some kind of pure experience-y, fleshy, interactional world elements. I just took all of the words and put them together, whose characteristics are informed by the QBist understanding of quantum theory as being about normative rules. I don't know what to call it. If we play the game of QBist words, maybe I would call it a kaboom, the QBoom, the de-anthropocentrized distillate of quantum measurement. QBism imagines powering the world. William James called it pure experience, where new being comes in local spots and patches. John Wheeler asked, is the entirety of existence built on billions upon billions of elementary acts of observer participancy? Instead of with a Big Bang, QBists wonder whether new existence comes into the universe all the time, everywhere, with little QBooms, as opposed to the Big Bang, which you might call the QBlui. But QBism is a project. So I think if you've absorbed that, you know as much QBism as I know. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thanks.
So I don't know, I can jump into my presentation. And as I was saying to Amanda, it already has several resonances with things that you were saying, Chris. So I think I may just point them out as they come instead of just making a list now. But the funny thing was that I almost had a slide very much like yours about the ontologies, and I have Merleau-Ponty's flesh, pure experience. Another one that is interesting, but I'm not going to be able to talk about, is Gilbert Simondon, who's this French philosopher who talks about individuation in physical, biological, psychological, social individuation. That's a very interesting philosopher, and he has a whole ontological approach that is very compatible with some of the things you were saying and some of the things I'm going to say, and that we are very keen to keep exploring. So let me see if you can see that. Is that okay?
So how do you say this, QuEn or QuEn?
I don't know.
I've been saying QuEn.
QuEn.
Or QuEn.
QuEn, almost QuEn. So I will just give you a bit of an overview of some enactive ideas, and in particular, ideas that I think might be of interest to a QBist. Ideas about what agency is, about sense-making, what that means in particular, and then a little bit about ontology and what it is to act in the world, and what is that relation that we have with the world. And I think then Hanne will continue in this on this line, looking at aspects of intersubjectivity and participation. Amanda already said this. I mean, this is this was born in the late 1980s and 1990s as an alternative to the metaphor of the mind as the brain, and the brain as a computer. This is it still is a dominant way of looking in cognitive science. It's called cognitivism, and there are all kinds of variants. And it has several problems, but I'm not going to dwell on that now. What the enactive approach offers is what I call a processual relational ontology that highlights historicity, and I will clarify what that means. It's like we are in a constant process of becoming, and in becoming we're changing. And I think there's a resonance there to this act of creation. Every time we engage with the world, something is created. We also reject reductive individualism, even though my talk may not actually give you enough evidence of that, because I'm going to talk about the idea of agency as a single agent, but then Hanne will come and correct all that. The idea is that there is a social dimension to all kinds of aspects of life and mind, and in particular to human kinds of mind, human perception, human, obviously communication and so on, and ways of thinking are inherently and constitutively social, even when we're on our own in an island, meditating or doing whatever. So the proposal is that we're always embodied biological, sensory motor, and social beings, engaged in the adventure of making ourselves and our world together with others and together with our material environment. And therefore, the concept of mind is best characterized always as an activity, something that's happening. We should call it minding, but it means something else. But it's essentially an activity of being a mind. And the slogan of the enactive approach is this one: laying down a path in walking, which is to try to establish a distinction between the idea that there is a world out there that we represent, that is already given, that is already decided, that is already, whose meanings I already have to adjust to, as opposed to something that is co-created with my activity as an agent. And this was taken from a line of a poem by Antonio Machado. So that we always are in the world, and we always leave some trace in the world, and this trace can form paths, and we are transversing these paths, both at the level of our own development, our own learning as individual forms of lives, but also as part of a community, as part of, we inhabit a world that is already there, moving like a stream of history into, our language, our concerns, our communities, and so on. So this idea of laying down the path in walking has several connotations. One is the idea of participation, because we are walking, we're doing something. The idea of community is also what I said. If it is a path, it's not just me constructing it, but it's part of something that's going on in participation with others. The idea that is an activity looks at the aspects of historical change, and there is an involvement of the world. I mean, we also have been accused at some point of being solipsistic and all that. So we share a similar agreements there with when we are actually, in fact, saying so much about how much of the world goes into the constitution of ourselves as agents. And important for other sort of discussions, even this one, about I think this slide was for a talk about climate change that I was giving. So important, I wanted to say that life mind always leaves a trace, and what we do has an impact on the world. There's lots of literature that, about enactive ideas. It all started in 1991 with this book at the top, The Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. But over the recent years, there have been all kinds of publications and applications in a variety of domains. I mean, if you like, the origin is embodied cognitive science, but we have seen applications in musical theory, in education science, in psychiatry, and so on. So that's all kinds of interest generated by essentially something that looks very unlike the traditional Cartesian dualistic approach to the mind. So there's if you like, a certain thirst for other theories and other approaches. So we may have heard that some of the things that enactivists say is that, for instance, instead of having a very sharp split between perception and action, what we have is always perception-action loops. And these loops, we call them enaction. We're doing something in the world. And this proposes to look at situated activity involving this coupling and this interaction between body and world as primary. So it's more like a participation versus a representation view. And the world is manifested in this way in relation to an agent. One of the problems that we have is that we give a lot of weight to our visual perception. And therefore we have an imagistic ontology or imagistic intuition about how to understand the mind. And this is very culturally embedded with our technologies, the history of pictorial art and so on, that looks at images as things that are out there. And if they're out there, they might be also in here, in my brain. And this could be the basis of understanding how I engage the world. But a much more an active perspective is to look, for instance, at tactile perception. And this drawing here is an example that has been used a lot in enactive approaches. When you feel the softness of a sponge. So what is this thing that's happening when you feel the softness of the sponge? Is the softness of the sponge something that is independent of your interaction with the sponge? Is it in your fingers? Is it in the sponge itself? Is a sponge soft to any kind of body? Is it soft for an ant? So perception is always not, this is, if there isn't any difference, any big difference between QBism and Enaction, is that Enaction is saying what the QBists say applies across the board. That is perhaps the thing. So in general, we engage the world in order to experience the world, but also to realize in that moment, actualize aspects of the world that are only manifested as the response to my engagement. So there's a famous quote by Merleau-Ponty that says the world is inseparable from the subject, but from a subject who is nothing but a project of the world. And the subject is inseparable from the world, but from a world that it itself projects. The word project and projects here might lead you in the wrong direction. It's not so much that there is a conscious project or anything like this, but essentially the point is that there is this intertwining between world and subject, or world and agent. And whenever you see this intertwining, it's a good bet to think that underlying it, there is a connection, like that quantum of action. There is ontological connection from which manifestations appear as momentarily distinct. And the distinction is not illusory. It's not, the distinction exists, but that distinction eventually is always relying on an underlying connection. And so the distinction is not a wall, it's not a separation. So, and that theme of breaking down these distinctions is something that recurs in the enactive approach quite a lot. And in a recent paper that we published with Hanne on ethics, on enactive ethics, we came to the conclusion that if you look at this triangle as the typical concerns of philosophy, you have a concern, historically, a concern with being, ontology, a concern with knowing, epistemology, a concern with doing, practice, how we value, how we make judgments, and so on. The enactive perspective had been working on elaborating ideas and concepts that actually lie in between these vertices, in between these points of the triangle. So between doing and being, we talk about agency or becoming, because you might think an agent is something that does something in the world, but the theory of agent that I'm going to talk about in a minute is also about how an agent is constantly becoming itself. Between doing and knowing, there's a concept of sense making, which is both an activity. It has to be active. It cannot not be active, but it's an activity that is underlying all kinds of cognitive categories. And between being and knowing, there is a concept of an engaged forms of approaching our interactions with the world. This is something that Hanne may be talking about later. It's a sort of an engaged epistemology. And of course, things are never so simple. When you start thinking about how you start doing this work, there are all kinds of interesting relations, and in that paper we discussed them, but I'm not going to talk about that now. But the whole point being that how to work with these hard and very entrenched distinctions, subject, object, mind, world, mind, matter, and so on. Well, this is a little bit what we aim for, to try to look what's underlying historically the origin of these distinctions, and what is it that those distinctions presuppose, and that may be connecting those differences. So I'm going to talk about agency because, agency is an idea that appears a lot in the QBist literature that we've been trying to acquaint ourselves with, and I think it might be interesting to see how we approach this question. Funny enough, I mean, when you look in cognitive science for definitions of agency, you won't find them. There are almost none. I think it's because this question of agency is a little bit in the blind spot of this the cognitivist approach. After all, if I'm a computer processing information in my head, what's the limit of that? I mean, I could be the other computer over there. Could also be an agent or something that subserves my information processes. Could be part of me without any significant way of telling what is an agent and what isn't. So we've been working for several years towards a definition of minimal agency, and we propose that there are 3 requirements for being able to call something an agent. Where these 3 requirements come from, they come from a synthetic approach that we were considering all kinds of instances in which we talk about agents, and we cannot remove any of these ideas from that example. It's very hard to do it. So the requirements are self-individuation, interactional asymmetry, and normativity. I will explain them. But the idea is that when we talk about an agent, we talk about a center of activity. It is the agent as opposed to something that is just happening. There's something that is originating a certain engagement that we would call an action, and that is different from just any sort of coupling. There's an asymmetry there because the agent is acting on the world. I mean, that doesn't mean that the world cannot impinge on the agent and provoke changes in the agent, but the agent, it is constitutive of the idea of agents that you can do this, that you can modulate your relation to the world in some way. In what way? Normatively. I mean, in the sense that you are pursuing some goal, the satisfaction of some conditions, avoidance of danger. You talk about death, precisely. That's the most basic vital norm, and so that is very much, those are the 3 requirements. Each of them are expanded and elaborated, and I'm not going to go a lot into it, but just give you a flavor of each of these requirements. The original work of Francisco Varela with Umberto Maturana is in the theory of autopoiesis, which is a theory of what is the organization of living systems. Maybe it's not necessary to look at this quote, but the idea is that the key aspect of this organization is that there is what they call operational closure, or organizational closure sometimes, meaning that there are processes that are related, like say biochemical processes, in such a way that the operation of those processes regenerate the conditions for the ongoing operation. And moreover, they create a sort of topological distinction, not a sharp wall, but a topological distinction between that entity and the rest of the environment. So there's a condition of self-production. You're making yourself, and you're making yourself distinct from the environment too. Distinct doesn't mean separate. That's what I wanted to highlight. Operational closure, you could conceptualize it very abstractly like this. I mean, if you're looking at many processes in the lab, or you're looking down the microscope, or looking at a living cell, you identify whatever, such and such chemical reaction the rise of temperature when this happens and so on. And if you intervene in these processes by trying to find out how they relate to each other, you may find that there are conditions, depicted here by the arrows, by which some processes enable others. I mean, when I stop this, when I break, say, if I open the membrane of a cell, very likely the reactions inside will stop because the chemicals will diffuse. And so I can say, okay, cell, there is an arrow to all these other reactions because they depend on the cell membrane, and so on and so forth. If you find that these enabling conditions form a network of that is close on itself, meaning that each of these yellow dots, circles, both has outgoing arrows to other yellow circles and incoming arrows, then that is basically the idea of operational closure. It does not mean that you don't have enabling conditions with processes outside this network. The plants depend on sunlight to make photosynthesis, but the sun does not depend, is not enabled by the existence of plants, and so on. If you look at real cases, you have all kinds of complicated diagrams that are, in biochemistry, you find increasingly complex instantiations of this kind of diagrams. So I was saying that typically this idea of autopoiesis, all this closure is symbolized with this little circle on itself, something that's circling on itself, because it's kind of like self-producing and self-distinguishing. And the environment is symbolized by this wavy line, and there's a kind of interaction with environment. But we will elaborate on that, what that means. But one thing that is already interesting is that if there are two conditions to being alive, one is you're producing yourself constantly by absorbing the matter and energy all the time, and you're making yourself distinct from the environment. What is the relation between those two conditions? If you were to take one of them and try to make it the best possible relation to the environment for that one condition, say you want to produce yourself from any interaction with the environment because you want to maximize, everything would be food, or nothing would be would damage the condition of your ongoing production. So you have to be open to all kinds of interactions with the environment and absorb them all. But the consequence of that is that you would just diffuse into the environment. You would just disappear as a series of processes. And if you wanted to become yourself very self-distinct, the best way to do it would be to draw a wall around you and say, well, nothing can change me because nothing can affect me. So between those two conditions that are contradictory, what living systems actually do is they are agents. That is to say, they regulate some of this over time. They regulate which conditions they are going to be open to, which conditions they're going to attempt to keep outside because they're noxious or whatever. So the very, if you like, in the very first idea of autopoiesis, this is not explicit, but once you start unpacking the relations, you realize that there's a dialectical, movement that takes you to like, well, when this is happening in the material world over time, you have to actively be doing something to prevent yourself from being too open or too closed. Now, I didn't mention some of the other technical terms here. So we talk about precariousness. I mean, all of the things I said, we always add this caveat. This is happening under precarious conditions. And technically, this means that none of these processes would continue to be doing what it does if you remove the network around it. You might think that that's trivial because it's enabled by other processes in the network, but in fact it's not, because it can be they can be redundantly enabled by external processes. So if you have something in your organism that whatever happens to you keeps doing exactly the same, well, that particular process is not precarious in this sense. So this is important because it means that the need to adapt, or the need to change and regulate your exchanges with the world, doesn't just arise from being in a harsh environment, which often we are in difficult environments. It arises already internally because we have to prevent ourselves from ongoingly decaying by the very processes that are decaying. So there's an ongoing restlessness in the idea of life that is implied here. And to cope with that, we have to be able to, what I call, have the capacity for adaptivity. To adapt, meaning regulate your interactions in such a way that you avoid crossing your boundary of viability. You avoid dying. This may be the most extreme situation because you're in a situation of danger and so on, but in fact, it breaks down into a whole normative landscape, into and there are many things that you do before you reach that boundary that are already available to you as an agent to, induce some change in environment in order to avoid going to the next stage that might be dangerous. So we say that adaptivity and autopoiesis are the condition of possibility of agents and sense making. This sounds very technical and so on, but another way to put it is that this is a way of naturalizing the mind, because the definition of autopoiesis does not circularly involve notions of what we're trying to define. It's talking about processes, networks, relations. The definition of adaptivity is not talking about mental states or intentions or anything. It's just talking about, well, some systems do this. Some animals, when they get too hot, they go in the shade. They just do it. There are mechanisms by which that can happen. But when you have all these combinations, what you have is a way in which not just you as an observer from the outside, but the entity itself, the organism itself, can access some of that normativity that is related to its vital condition. It can say, this is good, and that is better. But bacterium can do that because it swims up a sugar gradient. And of course, we can look at biochemical mechanisms of how that happens, but what it's actually doing is adapting, and therefore making us realize that of all the chemical interactions, this is particularly relevant one for this form of life. Interactional asymmetry. So if you look at the two arrows, autonomy, autopoiesis, don't worry, it's the same. Autonomy is more general than autopoiesis. But the two arrows between the entity, the living organism or the autonomous system or the agent and the environment, which is the wiggly line, they both go both ways, because if you were to write them as differential equations, you would have something like this. The states of the environment depend on, among other things, on what the agent is doing and vice versa. What is asymmetric is that the agent with these adaptive modulations is capable of sometimes, not all the time and not always successfully, modulate and regulate these interactions with the environment. Such as, for instance, when I am just walking along the cliff and I decide this may be dangerous. I can walk perfectly fine here, but I can also, move a few meters towards a safer area. I just change my relations to the environment and something else happened. Or if I'm thirsty and I want to, drink some water, the water will not just simply flow into my mouth. I just have to rearrange the physical conditions and relations between glass of water, mouth, and so on, and drink, and so on. So I'm modulating this, and these interventions in the environment, or this participation in the environment, is asymmetric in the sense that the agent is doing something. Normally, much more quickly, we say the agent is acting. But I don't want to use the word acting because that's the kind of word I want to be able to explain, to say where it's coming from. So if you have these three conditions, individuation, precariousness, and asymmetry and normativity, in the intersection of all of them, you have cases of agency. And here there are examples that we have in the book. And the examples sometimes can be controversial, so I don't want to go into them. But you could have one or two of these conditions and not be an agent, and maybe be an interesting process that might resemble an agent in some cases, and so on, like a robot. Okay, the whole question about artificial agency would be a big one, and I could probably come back to that in a minute, and so on. But these conditions are jointly necessary, no, jointly sufficient and individually necessary. What is interesting here, and here's what I think we might start getting into some other more of the subtle aspects, is that there is always the possibility that the boundary between an agent and the non-agent around it might be crossed, might change. So here's examples of these insects that can breathe underwater, or this spider too, you know, the diving bell spider. So how do they do it? Because they breathe air. Well, they go underwater and they have these tiny hairs on the abdomen, plastons, they're called, that trap bubbles of water, sorry, bubbles of air, and they're prevented from disappearing because of they're very tiny, and the surface tension makes it that the bubble stays there, like in these photos. And through these bubbles, they can breathe, and there's an exchange in the partial pressure of oxygen that makes them essentially have like an external lung. And this is an interesting case because what we have is a behavior, go underwater, that is momentarily, or actually for long periods, transforming your biology. You're now, you can breathe underwater by having an external physiology. It's as if you had this diagram and you had the organism composed of all these biochemical processes and so on, and suddenly a behavioral process became incorporated, made body into this, so the boundary between agency and non-agency is plastic. It can change, and that's why we say that agents are always in becoming. Okay, a few words about sense making, because I mentioned that without explaining what it was, but essentially with this word, we're trying to look at, we want a word that will tell us what is fundamentally similar or connected in all kinds of forms of mindedness. And we think that this is the word because it's an engagement of the agent with the environment in terms of the implications for its ongoing forms of life. So there, you got all the three elements there, because there is an engagement, there is this asymmetry, that the agent is doing something, not just being there. And it's doing this as an agent, and that's trying to conserve its form of life. And I put it there deliberately as a form of life because this can be applicable at other levels later on. And this is the normative aspect. What does these things that are happening now entail for my ongoing way of existence? So as I said, this is common to all forms of mindedness because, you know, it's common to, before we make distinctions such as action, perception, cognition, emotion, or different modalities of very complex form of mindedness, very sophisticated ones, they all seem to share this aspect. And this aspect can also be said, can be described as being non-indifferent. You care for what's going to happen. That is the core aspect of mindedness. Things matter to that agent. Not just to me as an observer. It's not just me saying, oh, this interaction seems to be important for it, and because of these reasons. The agent may not even have the access to the concept of reasons or any of causes or anything like this, but there is a difference, and that difference is a difference in sense making. They care about whether the sugar is there or not if you're a bacterium. Philosophically speaking, people usually, this comes from the Cartesian way of thinking, which is like, oh, if you have meaning and all these words and caring, you seem to be adding to the ontology of the world because the world doesn't have any of that. Well, that's, to me, to my mind, the wrong way to look about it. You know, sense making doesn't add anything to the world. Quite on the contrary, it radically diminishes the world into the things that matter to me. You know, like There's a famous example of the tick by Chekhov from Fuchs school, who talks about Umwelt and so on. And the tick seems to be just caring about three things, you know, three kinds of stimuli that will make it go onto the fur of a passing animal, and then it starts sucking blood and survive. So, yeah, no other things seem to be in that world. So there's a massive reduction of all the possible interactions with the world. And moreover, as I'm going to say later, not everything that affects you as a body is something you make sense. Okay, you may not really notice that something is affecting you. Okay. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I'm going to go quickly over this because I want to say that that's the condition of minimal agency that all agents we propose should satisfy. Then there are more specific forms of agency, like sensory motor agency. And I'm going to go a bit quicker here, but I want to reach the point because this is more like closer to the human case, but the really close to the human case will be what Hanne would say later. So this is a diagram of a sensory motor scheme. This idea comes from Jean Piaget, and this is a baby suckling from a bottle and so on. And what you have is in each of these segments of arc, what you have is a convergence of body processes and environmental processes. Like breathing, you have lungs, muscles, diaphragm, and so on, and air. They converge into one sensory motor coordination that leads to the next one. You start suckling from the bottle, and you have the bottle, and you have muscles in your mouth, and so on, and then you go into the next sensory motor coordination, and then you swallow the milk. And all of that forms, in this case, a circular sensory motor scheme. These schemes, what is normally not recognized is that they have other consequences, you know, where there are noises being made, but that doesn't seem to be part of the scheme itself. But we have to acknowledge that as being physical interactions, there are all kinds of implications for each of these sensory motor coordinations. It may well be that some of these implications can become enabling conditions for some of the either environmental or bodily conditions. It may be that repeatedly performing an action makes you better at it because you're building up, let's say, muscle strength. So working in your desk for a long time, suddenly you realize there is a certain emerging order to how you put in things around you. You're changing your environment in this way as a consequence of your actions, perhaps not intentionally. And the idea is that these schemes can form networks of relations, structural relations, functional relations, and so on. I think I'm going to give an example in a minute, and that will be clearer. But the point is that our sensory motor repertoire is organized. It's not just simply that I can do equally well at any time, any sort of action. Some things make sense to be done in certain contexts and not in others. I'm cooking, and therefore there's certain actions that are related to this activity of cooking that are clustered together, and they depend on each other, and they call each other all the time. But are different from when I'm driving a car or something like this. So the interesting thing, and this is a point of relation with the pragmatists, is that the moment you're activating an action, you're at the moment I'm gonna grab the glass of water, all these internal relations that have been sedimented in your body and in the environment somehow color the way you perform the action. And George Mead, another pragmatist, has a whole long quote on this about how when I'm going to grab the book that is over there, what I see about the texture of the book is already shaping the movement that, you know, when I try to reach and grab it, it's already shaping all the possibilities of things I can do, all the things I'm not able to do, that also shaping this engagement. So the truth is that there is no action that is isolated. You're always acting as in a way that is connected to all your possibilities of other things you might be doing, other aspects that you expect, you know, things that you expect to happen maybe, but at the same time, things that cannot happen at the same time. You're inhibiting something else. So when you know, this is a point that is more important for psychologists, because psychologists always perform experiments when you have to press buttons. And the action of pressing button seems like, okay, you know, what this unproblematic, it seems very simple. It has some examples here. But the point I want to make is that the action of the sensory motor scheme of pressing a button is radically different in different contexts. It's not the same. The kinematics of the movements that is measured is not the same, not the same. And in this particular case, example, if you look at this photo, assuming that red button is something like an alarm button, you see that this is a fake photo, because you never would press an alarm button in such a, you know, calm and composed way, you know, with your middle finger like this, or just touching it a bit lightly. You would be in a different situation. A real alarm situation, your sensory motor schemes will make you punch that button or do something else. So you see how we intuitively know, you know, that there is an action seems to be disconnected from its meaning, its context, in this way. So we have all these networks, these hypothetical clusters of sensory motor schemes, of sensory motor repertoires. All of them might themselves fulfill the conditions of agency. That's a big leap, but it's explained in the book carefully. But it's like there may be closure at this level, there may be asymmetry, and there may be normativity. I mean, that there is normativity should not be surprising, because not everything we do has to do with our biology. Not everything we do has to do with being, you know, keeping ourselves alive. We care about things that are not about our immediate survival. In fact, sometimes we care about things that go against our survival, like if you're a smoker and the habit of smoking, essentially it is inducing a normativity and you're acting according to it. But it's not good for your biology. So that means, well, this is telling us something about that there is another level in which this agency is, or these conditions of agency are being manifested. And there will be others to do with social agency. They're not exactly the same. So there is, if you like, an organic aspect of our agency, a sensory motor aspect, and a social aspect. But we also sometimes may genuinely call them bodies. You could say we have an organic body, a sensory motor body, and social or linguistic body. But I think that we'll come to that later. We can talk about it. These things, because we engage in here the act of smoking, for instance, not a particularly good one for organic survival. The point that I want to say is that there's so many different ways in which this act is enacted. There can be all kinds of flexible, variable forms of engagement. I mean, these clusters are not kind of prescribed, like there's a sequence that must be, but these ways, they do follow a certain norm. So some things cannot happen in the wrong order, but there's a lot of flexibility and context dependent on how this happens. So this is what we do in everyday life all the time. Now, the traditional view of the act then looks like this. We have a separation between agent and environment. We have motivations, intentions, skills, properties that we attribute to the agent, and affordances, solicitations, risks, conditions, and so on that we attribute to the environment. They come together, we enact the sensory motor scheme, and that it produces changes in ourselves and in the environment. So we have a situation, an act, and a new situation. What we're proposing here, and I have not really given you the whole explanation as to why, but it's something that's slightly different. We have all kinds of relations, intensities, potentials, all kinds of complex combinations of processes that are, some of them are environmental, some are of the agent, some are in the process of being absorbed or incorporated by the agent, etc., etc. They come together into a moment of individuation or concretization in which both the scheme and the relevant processes in the environment together are engaging now into a clear, distinct, if you like, or momentarily distinct sort of a situation, and grabbing this particular aspect of the environment and manipulating it, or and that then leads to a new condition, and this, if you like, a situation of metastability, defacing, so something gets distinct, like the faces of matter, you know, like goes from liquid to gas and something like this. It's a clear change. And then something is created, which is a new metastability, a new situation that might lead to further action. And this is both an act and a fact. You see, this is an agent-related fact. It's both the act that I engage with, but I have made manifest aspects of the world in my doing so that become factual, at least for me. Remember the guy with the sponge? That's what the guy with the sponge is doing. And so, and I think this is an interesting thing that might be of interest for QBists, is that agent-related facts are created. You know, they actualize particular potentialities, things that are, you know, these wiggly lines that are hard to describe, that might relate to that ontology question. They become particularized, they become individuated, concretized, like the softness of the sponge. They're not arbitrary, not just anything goes. They follow lawful relations, and they follow the norms. The norms also are not arbitrary. My access to the norms as an agent that is finite, changing, and so on, might have a subjective aspect that I understand them to be a certain way, and I may not really know everything I need to know. As I said, my body may be affected, say, by, you know, ionizing radiation, and I may not feel it. I don't want to feel it, but it will eventually have a consequence for my autopoiesis, for my organism. So I don't make all the distinctions that are relevant for my body. I just make some, the ones my organs of, you know, allow me to make, my actions allow me to make. And agent-related facts are both objective and subjective. I mean, none of the aspects of these two aspects is more real than the other. It is the sponge is really soft, but it's really soft in that enactment that I experience with a particular combination of movements, sensations, you know, ways of engaging that bit of the world. This is the beginning of a slide about historicity, and that's the last slide about historicity, because it's a very long thing to go into. But the whole point is that the scales matter. We seem to be always acting in this scale of the behavioral scale of the present, but in fact, all kinds of norms relate to different forms of processes that circle or get grounded in ever larger loops of temporal connections, such as, for instance, I am talking right now, I'm enacting, you know, my way of expressing myself, my movements, and so on. But I'm also, you know, I don't know, I am like an academic, I have a career, and so on. What I'm doing now is also related to that. And this, you know, I'm speaking a certain language, and this language is also something that is historically moving. So I am engaged in very different scales, and sense making is happening at very different scales. And sometimes when we think something is past, like, you know, the existence of English is already there before I learn it. In fact, not so much. It's ongoing. It's changing today. You know, as we very well know, the language continues to change with our use of the language. So the historicity thing is more complex. I just won't have time to do it justice. So final point then, which I think it will relate to the things that Fries was talking about, because I asked the question, in what ways are agents affected by the world? Because the moment of when you perform the measurement, you describe that, okay, there's an outcome for the agent. But the question is, at what level is that outcome happening? So an agent may be affected by the world as a physical system, like any physical system. And we know that's not exactly what is being said here. An agent is an autonomous system. It can be affected by the world in its biological organization. It may put me at risk, but I may not really make sense of that, at least at the moment that this connection is happening. I may not just simply know that something bad is happening for me. an agent, it can be affected as a sense maker. I'm something that I am caring about in the world. I notice it makes a difference, and it makes a difference to what I understand of the world. And I like that there was, in some of the definitions in one of the papers, and I can't remember which one, you say, Chris, something about like an agent engages in actions, and the consequences of which matter to them. And I think that's an interesting thing to that. I mean, there's this aspect of not being indifferent. So you may be affected at that level. So, but you see that there is the implications are like in this diagram. You may be affected as a sense maker, and that means you're affected as a living organism and as a physical system. But it doesn't go the other way around. If you're affected as a physical system, I may not be affected as an organism. Whatever, something, there's a little shadow that crosses across my skin at the back of my head, and I don't notice it. I don't care about it, and it doesn't put me at risk. So that, and so on. So there's this three kinds of ways in which things can happen. A further complication is that there may be different kinds of access to consciousness. I mean, there may be that I am affected as a sense maker, and I cannot yet reflectively say what happened, or even say that something happened. There is intentionality at the bodily level, but that we don't necessarily reflect on. We know that we're slightly uncomfortable, and therefore we just move a bit, change the distance to the thing that we are reading, for instance, and therefore that is done. That is, if you like, has an intentional aspect. It's about intentionality, but it's not necessarily reflective. I'm not reflecting. I mean, I'm just doing it. So there may be all kinds of complications in that sense of how something impacts your experience. I'm going to stop there because I've been talking a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.
Some student sent me a paper just yesterday. He was voicing all of his complaints in the QBism section, and one of them was that we're very vague on what an agent is. We never say what an agent is. And I guess I have recognized this as a weakness, but often I just say, well, we don't need to give a definition beyond just saying that the agent takes actions on the world, is autonomous to some extent, takes actions, and cares about what the actions will do, etc. But it looks like you guys have gone much, much more deeply into, I mean, clearly, that was the big message I got from today. And when I heard what you were saying, I didn't react in my usual very negative way. When a physicist says, you don't tell us what an agent is, what they want is, an agent is, it has to have at least 10 to the 23 atoms in it, things like this. So it's a very different flavor of explicating than the physicist wants. So that's not a question yet. Maybe I should save it for discussion.
Yeah.
Hanne, you're on.
I'm up. Okay. Let's see if I can share the screen. All right. So yes, I will take it from where Ezequiel left off and provide the part that goes more towards participation, and questions of agency will come back at the end. We put some questions there as well, as suggestions to discuss. So I will talk about the part of enactive theory that we've been developing together, which is called participatory sense making. It's a theory of intersubjectivity, and then move towards what we call an engaged, or rather better, an engaging epistemology, in which actually the agent changes by knowing. That's going to be the final conclusion, if you like, but I'll take a fairly short road to it. So we propose participatory sense making in contrast to traditional theories of social cognition that think that when people interact together, all they are doing is figuring each other out. They're hidden states in their heads, which we can't see. They are static, and we have to make inferences based from our own mind in order to see what other people are thinking or feeling. And the bodies almost completely are out of view. And there's actually not much connection between people. So in contrast to that cognitivist view, we propose participatory sense making. So if you like, we turn that picture on its head. And what participatory sense making is just like I will give a very brief introduction. The two basic pillars of it are that people are sense makers in the way that Ezequiel has just been explaining. And then the second pillar is that we define social interactions as emergent processes between people that are influential in what participants to interactions can do, to the point that they can take them up in certain ways or even co-determine their cognition or their intentions. So I will explain this in a little bit more detail again. So people are sense makers, which means all the things that Ezequiel has just explained, embodied, emerging agency, and so on. Things matter to them. We regulate our interactions with our world in relation to our self-organization and our autopoiesis, and that's why things matter to us. So we aren't just in black and white, we are colored, and we blush when things are important to us and so on. And the world is more full with our experience and how things affect us. And so that's a very quick sense making. But so the other pillar is about the interaction processes that emerge between us and that can take us up in certain ways. And so interaction processes also have a certain autonomy to them. And you can think of how that happens when you're walking to a destination, say on a pavement or in a corridor or in a train corridor, as here in this scene from North by Northwest. You're just going to the thing you want to do, and someone approaches from the other side that has nothing to do with you, and the person ends up in front of you. And then in order for you to get out of that, you step to the other side, and so does the other person in the same moment. And then you step to the other side again, and a little coordination emerges between you. You didn't wish for this coordination to happen. It just emerges, it picks you up. It makes that you have to interact some more. And you also have to interact in order to get out of this interaction. So this is an interaction taking on a life of its own and co-determining your intentions in the moment beyond what you had been intending before this all happened. And so we kind of put that on the map of cognitive science of social cognition, and you can measure it in all kinds of ways and measure the relation between interaction dynamics and what happens to individuals as they engage in them. So we published this, when you get two self-organizing agents interacting with the world and regulating it, the interaction also emerges between them. That's what this diagram shows. And so the definition that we gave for this is that social interaction is a regulated coupling between at least two of these autonomous agents, where the regulation that emerges is aimed at aspects of the coupling itself, so that it constitutes an emergent autonomous organization in the domain of relational dynamics, without, and this is important, destroying in the process the autonomy of the agents involved. So the agents are being autonomous and self-maintaining. The interaction between them also takes on a certain autonomy and influences them. But it's important that each of these agents remains autonomous, even though their autonomy and their self-organization can be augmented or reduced in the process, so that they can still participate. If one of their autonomies is destroyed in the process, they are not a participating agent anymore, and we are not anymore having a social interaction. So it's kind of to put a boundary between now we are in the presence of this kind of social interaction. And if any of these conditions is not met, we have another kind of situation. But it's like a sort of ground configuration for having participation in sense making or for coordination in social interactions. So we propose that social interactions can indeed constitute or co-constitute our cognition. And there is an experiment by Malika Auvray and some colleagues in Compiègne who have shown this, that in a certain experimental situation, the individual decision, so to speak, or the individual recognition of what's going on by the participants can only be explained if you also take into account the interactive dynamics. So that's one of the basics of this participatory sense-making theory, both individuals as sense makers and interaction dynamics that take people up in certain ways and have autonomy. And on the basis of this, we have also written this book, Linguistic Bodies, of which some of the basic tenets, if you like, are that we are all different bodies, all the people on Earth, but also we all have different bodies, or are different bodies ourselves. Like Ezequiel said, we have a sensory motor body, a metabolic body, a social and a linguistic body. We participate in this living stream of language, making and weaving threads of meaning as we speak. And at that level, we are also different bodies so the way we speak can interact with how we are metabolically or sensory motorically interacting with the world. So these different bodies are entangled with each other as well. And we incorporate and incarnate ways of speaking, notions from other people. We are actually often, when we speak, quoting other people, whether we realize it or not. And we have to sort of either take our agency to participate in that willingly, or go against it when we feel we are speaking according to, for instance, what our grandmother used to say, and we don't want to propound that anymore. So we have to kind of fight against that way of speaking moving through us, if you like. There's also an element to it that we are always fully participating. So even infants who don't speak yet, or people who aren't always verbally interacting, are still fully participating as they are. And we pick them up automatically, sort of on a basic level, as full participants in this enactive way of seeing things. But I'll give an example later that complicates that a little bit. And we, as linguistic bodies, are constructed out of and construct ourselves out of utterances and relations between utterances as they are uttered, as they are ongoing. And this is our becoming. So I guess maybe speaking could be little kabooms. And another important tenet of this is that abstraction and detachment, as in scientific observation, presuppose always a shared world. So that's, I think, where my confusion came from about what happens to the wave function when you use an eraser on the hero. I mean, the social world for me was there, so that's why I was confused. But that's one of the tenets of our approach as well. So now from that, I've proposed over the last few years an engaging epistemology, which is to do with sort of deepening this notion of participatory sense making in terms of how it matters to us. Our being is implicated when we encounter the world as scientists, but also as humans meeting each other. And we are concerned with meeting the world as it is, like doing it justice, if you like. So there's a kind of tension of letting things be, where you let it be by engaging it in the proper way, but you cannot but do that from your being, from your perspective, from your agency, and but at the same time you meet something that's different from you, and what happens in between that. And that's the kind of tension that this engaging epistemology tries to flesh out. And so an example that I find quite illustrative comes from philosopher Kim McLaren. She says that, or she gives this example of a horse and a trainer, where the horse trainer just is interested in making money with the horse, and he trains the horse really hard. And eventually the horse becomes sick and sullen, and it may even die if this gets taken to an extreme. So this horse trainer is not letting the horse be. He's interested in his relation and what he can gain, but forgoes the being of the horse in this, and actually participates in destroying the horse through this. So the relation between a knower and what we know has immediate ethical implications, and also can change the being, another being, or an element of being in the world, if you like. So we have to be careful of this and recognize a being as it is. Like a horse needs to play, it needs to roam, it's a living being, that interacting with it to make money with it is a possibility, but we have to respect its being enough so that it can also remain itself and in relation with us, and will through that change, and so will we. So an implication of this is also that if a horse trainer treats the horse so badly that it dies, his being a horse trainer also may end because he hasn't treated the horse well. So there's immediate implication on the knower themselves out of how they know what they're interacting with. It can have existential implications in that direction too. And so Kim says that we learn that from letting others be, other people be, because with objects we don't always necessarily notice this, but when we're in connection with a human being, this can be, or with an animal, this can become more clear to us, this impact that it also has on us. And she bases this on Merleau-Ponty's notions of intercorporeality and intersubjectivity, which mean that intercorporeality means that we share a world and we act on things through others, through seeing others acting on the world. We also learn to act on the world in a way vicariously almost. But also we are mutually situated in a world. We situate ourselves and each other over against each other. And in this way, we take up a project of letting each other be in relation to each other always. And that's part of the basic organization of the world, that we're also always doing that. And it's a bodily concrete thing that we do. It's not abstract. So when talking about the phenomena in this approach, letting them be over there and having a phenomenon, letting it be, when I'm knowing it, it changes them. And so the phenomena are always in a circulation between me and them. Yeah, it's also Merleau-Ponty's idea of the flesh. We generate things as we know them. Yeah, I think that's something that we share with QBism as well. So letting be, just to be absolutely clear about it, is not a disengaging. Letting be is not this, oh, let it be and do not engage. It's actually a particular caring for engaging, or a particular carefulness with engaging. So there is a connection. It's not a separation. And it's also not an over-determination. It's not a kind of having a theory about a phenomenon and out of that trying to determine it so that it cannot be itself anymore. I will give an example also in a moment that illustrates that a bit more. So it is engaging. It is paradoxical and ambiguous because you bump into differences all the time. And both known and knower continually change in this kind of epistemology, and so does their relation. So all these three elements are effective factors in knowing. And you can understand that also as a kind of continual becoming of everything in participation. So as the knower, the known develop and become and change, and their relations change as well, all of that changes in relation to each other continually as well. And so now, not just the interactors that we might be studying are colorful and engaged and experiencing, but also the researcher looking at it. And I couldn't do this with the drawing, but actually the researcher could go into the interaction of the three people down there and be changed by the interaction like that as well. That's actually the point of it. And so I will give an example to illustrate this. Here's a person in the world, and he meets a scientist thinking about autism, looking through an autism lens, and says, ah, this is autism. Here we have an autistic person. The scientist has a theory of autism and thereby puts the person into the box of autism. And one part of this theory used to be, or still is, in lots of approaches, that an autistic person has difficulty communicating and interacting, and they are socially, they have a social lack, if you like. But by putting the person in that box and determining them like that, this is a case of over-determination. You put the person in the box, determining them like that, And thereby actually you make them go away because they cannot interact with you then, paradoxically, if you have determined them like that. And so eventually they might just leave the scene and not interact with you anymore. And so this is like a mainstream, long-standing theory of autism that sets autistic people apart in this way. But over the last 20 years or more, actually, people with autism have been doing lots of self-advocacy and speaking up and attempting to get out of this box. And of course, trying to participate, which it's funny because when there's a scientific theory like this and it puts people apart like that and determines that they cannot participate, it also actually makes relations between ordinary people and autistic people different, if that's the sort of societal idea that comes from these kind of scientific theories, and it makes a disconnection between, or it risks making a disconnection between autistic and non-autistic people. So these scientific theories have that kind of influence, and that's actually ethically dangerous and societally dangerous because it sets people apart more than they should be. And this, I think, relates to the mattering, why things matter to agents. And that's not just an abstract discussion, it actually makes differences in society to who and how people can participate and be themselves in the world. And so if you have this kind of overdetermination and thereby setting people apart and making it difficult for interactions to emerge between them, you can only change that if you as a person thinking or meeting an autistic person also change and actually move towards them, rather than expect, which is one of the corollaries of this traditional theory of autism, is that all the onus is on the autistic person to change to a non-autistic way of being so that they can interact with a non-autistic person. But here, an outcome of this kind of engaging epistemology would be that someone who is trying to think about autism in a medical sense has to also do the work of moving towards the autistic person through their understanding. So it's this moving from both sides in both directions and changing on both sides. That's important, as well as then being able to change or have a different relation. Interactions can then emerge and they can then participate in this ongoing becoming of the two knowers and their relations together as well. And so I've also characterized that as a relation between the tensions in both loving and knowing. I won't go into that here, but I have a paper out of that title, Loving and Knowing. But what it means is that knowing is an ongoing existential dialectical relation or tension between being and being in relation. So this ongoing becoming is always happening. It's existential because it matters to our very existence. Continuing being, continuing becoming is an outcome or not of these knowing relations. And it's unavoidably paradoxical and full of uncertainties, inconsistencies, and ambiguity and contradictions because we have these different bodies, we are different bodies with each other, and they do contradictory things sometimes, but that's part of what it is to be a bodily, living, contextualized agent or being in this world. And it means that in a way we must recognize and hold these tensions as they exist rather than be afraid of them or shutting them down by over-determining things. And so it's always a balancing between under and over-determining. So under-determining would be having so little relation that you're not knowing the other anymore. It could also be an over-respecting of another person and thereby foregoing relation. And over-determining is, like I said, having a theory and just trying to determine the other too much so that their being has no place anymore, and they cannot meet you as a knower. That is a very quick overview of engaging epistemology. And then we had some ideas for questions to discuss. And then the first one would be, and Ezequiel, feel free to jump in here. Yeah, all of us can, I think, now speak to these questions. So the first one is, QBism defines agents as entities that can act in the world with consequences that matter to them. In what way is this mattering important for QBism? And the second is following Ezekiel's point about the ways in which we are affected. Which of these agents are physical systems, agents are autonomous living systems, and agents are sense makers, would more closely correspond to the QBist understanding of an agent's making a measurement, and what would that mean? And then the third one relates to ontology. If QBism is not a description of the world, but a manual for acting in an uncertain world, what does that mean, if anything, about ontology? Does it mean that there is no static ontology? Is ontology always changing? Is it about this that is so evocative, Amanda, your work on the participatory universe and meeting Wheeler and Putnam meeting. That's yeah, this participatory ontology. What is it when we generate a discussion between these different fields, these two fields here, as we are doing now? And maybe I would like to say something already to the first question about the consequences that matter to, so the QBist hero that you put up, Chris, and when you started erasing the hero, and then what does it mean for the wave function? That can be related, I think, to Ezekiel's mentioning of precariousness. So agents, enactive agents, are these kinds of agents that are living with the risk of being erased, or their own existence erasing themselves, because they are living beings. And this is their precariousness. And that's, for an activist, why things, or related to why things matter to agents. We are at risk of losing our agency just by living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these are tough questions. These are the toughest questions I've ever gotten, I think. You know, so I like the way you put that. You know, what matters is that you want to live. So I think it's exactly, so I'm not quite sure exactly how you said it. Let me get closer. It's, you know, this is all pre-QBism, actually. This question, you can take it to decision theory. So when Savage wrote the book about how to make better decisions, it's, you know, the presupposition is that things matter to the agent, and they try to quantify that by positing a utility function. So if they take this action, how good will it be to them with in some aspect? So the utility might measure money, or it might measure happiness, or it might measure reproductive ability, and you try to give a mathematical model of what matters to you. And one of the key results of that particular development of probability theory and decision theory was that you start with actions and consequences, and you put an ordering of desirability for the various consequences. And then they prove some theorems that you can always find a utility function and a probability distribution such that you should act so that your expected utility is maximized. So, and this is, you know, this is all below QBism. It's decision theory. So there's no quantum mechanics in this. yet. What exactly was your question again?
The way I probably understand this is that, well, I think you answered it, because in highlighting that things matter to the agent as part of your definition of agency, or your approach to characterizing agency, you're highlighting this, but I thought that maybe something else was being highlighted, that they would care about the outcome, that they wouldn't be indifferent, that the result of this would either confirm, say, their theory, the experiment that they're, and in a sense, I wonder, it probably is not a problem for QBism, because you could probably think of those utility functions, such as it allows you to make better predictions, or but what if there is no clear utility function, precisely because the norms are in flux? You're in this moment of transformation, that you're starting to care about something that you didn't care about before.
Yeah.
And that might be an issue, but it may be connected to this issue of ontology, maybe connected that, oh, we're going to a point then before these things are clearly distinguishable, or clearly in place, or clearly manifested. And therefore, when I know that I'm doing an experiment in order to best predict the outcome, or that, or even further than that, to confirm my hypothesis, I know very well how I can value the outcome of the experiment, and that's why I don't think it's a problem for the QBist perspective. But if you look at wider possible ways of looking at knowing, as a scientist, but maybe also as a human being, it may be that this subjective approach to probability always relies on that possibility of you being able to quantify that utility, and that creates, the question becomes, what happens when you can't? Precisely.
I absolutely. May I share screen again? If I can find a certain photo. World electronic, and she ran across all the traffic, and then of course I took the you go underneath the traffic to get to the Arc de Triomphe, and then when I got to the other side, to my surprise, there she was. She had made it. And I use this as an example of an agent taking an action on the world, but not having used probability theory to get a better handle on whether that was a wise action to take. And very often, or not, almost all of our actions, none of us are using probability theory to decide which actions we should take. But there are some instances in which we are certainly better off if we've got the time before needing to make a decision, and if we have the computational resources available to us before needing to make the decision, then it's in our best interest to play around with trying to quantify our expectations. So there's certainly a level of thinking that comes before probability theory. And probability theory only applies to those cases where we can distinctly give a list of all of the consequences of our actions. If we can't draw up a list, if it's, if the problem is still too amorphous to draw up a list of the consequences of the actions, then we can't put a preference ordering on the list. So maybe there's a calculus that would help us there, and maybe not, but it's not for probability theory. Okay, in some cases, not only would it help us to use probability theory if we've got the time and the resources, but we can do better still by using the formalism of quantum theory to help us in our decision making. So it's not that there are stabilized facts of, you put it so nicely a minute ago, I can't quite remember. These things aren't necessarily given. So there are times when you are, how did you put it? When you're in flux and you can't even identify a utility function. There are certainly situations like this all the time. The conception here is that we use quantum theory when we are in a stable enough situation that we can identify the possibilities and we can write down probabilities for them. But that is more a statement about where we are than rather than of the world itself. So when we clearly recognize that when we're in those situations where we know that the agent's involvement is crucial, then we use quantum theory. And there are some cases where you can play as if there are facts of the matter and the agential component is not so large, then you can get away with using just probability theory without quantum theory. But did that answer the question or the cluster of the beginning?
To me, it is an interesting answer because it makes me think of two things that I find very interesting. One is, we were talking just now about how some ideas of agency might be interesting for QBism, that the ideas that from an active perspective. But I also think there is another possibility of an influence going the other way. And I think that one thing that from an enactive perspective would be nice to develop, and it's not developed, is a better understanding of how we arrive at this sort of thinking in terms of probabilities. How do we ever, not so much about the history of mathematics, but rather in more an embodied sense in which we are able to start discerning possible outcomes and start discerning them as more or less likely based on what we know and so on. And I think there's already almost there in the idea that we all come to every situation prepared by our experience. And we know that our first attempt is to approach the situation based on past cases that look similar. They might be exactly the same. So maybe if I act the same, it will be exactly, I assimilate the new situation into what I know. But it's done all very not consciously necessarily. I'm not doing a calculus or anything like this. So that's one line, you know, that I think that would be interesting to work on that, just to see, like, from an embodied perspective, at what level I started to start calculating or at least attempting to estimate possible outcomes and understanding them from an embodied perspective. Because once I already know how to work with probabilities, there is no mystery. It makes sense to do it, you do it. But at what point that transition happened in the forms of agency and engaging the world. That's one. But the other question, it was very clear that if you have a context in which you can calculate the possible outcomes, and that's very clear, and then you can you can use probabilities and quantum theory as well. That works perfectly well. I don't have any problems with that story. But the question that arises, which is more not even a question, it's more like what happens in the context of discovery, something, you know, when you are confronted with something new, a new effect, and so on. How is that manifested? I mean, perhaps it's simply manifested as, okay, it didn't work the way it should work. I need to think about it. I need to rethink it and then find out what happened. But in principle, okay, it's not a problem. I'm not saying this is a problem for QBism, not at all, because you just simply have to rework your beliefs and so on. But in principle, it's interesting to see when you couldn't map all the possible outcomes because there was something that you were not accounting for. It was not simply because you missed something, but it was a genuinely new effect. Or how does
Yeah,
QBism deal with that?
I remember in our earliest days of thinking about this, we were influenced by a physicist who promoted Bayesian probability for better understanding statistical physics and thermodynamics, and which was and continues to be a subject that also has its own conundrums and paradoxes. And this fellow, his name was E.T. Jaynes, Edwin T. Jaynes. And he promoted the idea that a lot of the paradoxes could be cleaned up by adopting the Bayesian notion of probability. And anyway, he was writing a book just at about the time that we were first thinking of this 30 years ago. This semester is the 30th anniversary of when Carlton Caves and Rudiger Schock and I got together, and we're all going to be in New Mexico for 5 weeks together, starting next week. Anyway, Jaynes was writing this book, and one of his, and then he died. So he never finished his book. But one of the chapters he started for it was a big complaint about the weakness of Bayesian probability. The weakness, as he saw it, was that it didn't know how to, or didn't have formal rules for deciding the sample space. So for instance, we think of a coin, we can, what happened? That is very interesting. I did my thumb like this. There's a little symbol that is following my thumb. So Zoom has AI technology in it. It showed a little thumbs up symbol as if it's doing that for you guys. Maybe I should turn, well, I can't turn my camera off. Anyway, so he saw it as a weakness in Bayesian probability theory that it couldn't address the question that you just asked, which is, where does the sample space come from? And so I give you a stupid, silly example is I flip a coin. That's what I was doing, flipping a coin. And we assign probabilities to it falling heads or it falling tails. It's silly and it's stupid, but in principle, it's possible. I could flip the coin, it flips, it comes down and hits the ground and lands on its edge. This is something so unexpected that we didn't write down a probability for its occurrence, yet it happened. How do you then update your old probability assignment to a new one for the next time you flip a coin? And this is what Jaynes was complaining about, that there's no formal rules that anyone knows of how to do this. And there may not be any formal rules. But there's room to play in the foundations of probability theory, I think, where you try to take into account these matters. And I'm sure we could dig up papers where people have attempted, but there's probably no consensus on what to do in those cases. The way I see it, that probability theory and quantum theory live at the level where we say, okay, we've got all of that sorted out. I believe that I can identify the consequences of this action, the consequences of that action. I can identify them and I can model them. I can write down probabilities and I can write down these measurement operators for modeling it. That's where quantum theory starts to live. So it's not general. It's not it's not a general statement about all of life. But I think the value for coming back to some of the philosophies that I'm attracted to, pragmatism mostly, William James's ideas mostly, is that whereas James had so many great ideas, and maybe Merleau-Ponty as well, in other walks, they had great ideas, but it doesn't mean that the ideas can't be made more precise through the laboratory of science. And that's what I really think the role of quantum theory is, that it's a very precise laboratory where we learn that we can't easily hold on to old classical style ontologies. We see that, in our most fundamental theory of physics, that something's got to give, but we've got a precise handle on it. And now the hope is that we can now take what we've learned from this very precise laboratory and start applying it back out into wider considerations about the world as a whole.
One way I was thinking about it when you were all speaking, but maybe I'm conflating too many things, is when you have like a minimal agent that where certain things matter to it, and those things could be continuing to self-produce or continuing to draw the boundary between yourself and the environment, and those are two things that matter to you, but those things are in conflict. And it makes me think of like when you're writing down these quantum states, and it's all the different actions that you could take on a system. And Chris, you're saying like there's nothing prescribing how much to care about any given one, how much to stake on any given one. But what is prescribed is how those are all yoked together so that you don't want to care in such a way or act in such a way that you have a short loss or that you die. So it seems like there's this freedom in how you navigate agency in some way, or how you navigate maintaining yourself as an agent. But what quantum theory is telling us is that the way those are linked together is not what you would think, is not intuitive in some sense.
Not intuitive.
Or not classical.
Not classical. That's right. If we QBists are right, this actually is the intuitive understanding of the world. And it was the classical understanding that was fraught with difficulty. And some philosophers have noted that. Pragmatists, not knowing anything about quantum mechanics, still, at least the classical American pragmatists, accepted the idea that the world was full of chance, and that you couldn't have a Laplacian demon, and that the world, Peirce had the idea that laws themselves evolve like living entities. The laws of physics evolve. So you might say, well, that's the intuitive understanding of the world, and this static thing that's classical physics is the non-intuitive one. I didn't quite see the connection that you were trying to make, though, between the normative idea of the probabilities being connected to each other and the minimal notion of agency that Ezequiel was talking about. The minimal agents surely don't use probabilities. Very high level agents use probability theory, and then only with further education do they use quantum theory. So quantum theory is a very exclusive club within the broad perspective of agents. I would think, very minimal tip of agents. I mean, so what was the connection you were seeing?
Well, maybe I'm thinking in terms of like what Ezequiel was saying about almost like a bodily understanding of these probabilities, or like something that comes before actually writing them down and reflecting on them and having like a linguistic understanding of all this stuff. But right, like the bacterium has to still make decisions as to whether it's going to swim this way or that way, and it has some bodily way of doing that, where it has to negotiate between things that it cares about that work against each other.
Absolutely, but
Yeah.
it's not a bodily understanding of probabilities. I wouldn't put it that way, because if you put it that way, it makes it sound as if the probabilities are there underneath things, and that the agent sort of has some rudimentary grasp of the probabilities that are there. Instead, I would turn it around and I would say the bacterium has agency. It has things that it prefers over other things, even if it hasn't articulated those things, and that's real. That's something that is happening in the world, and it's only when you want to get fancy about it, and so very high level agents then, not bacteria, but samples of mankind after after 2,000 years ago or so, started to have the apparatus for trying to better quantify how they should make their decisions. But it's not that the probabilities are underneath it all, and it has always been acting according to the true probabilities. It's only it's akin to learning how to play a sport. So you learn how to play tennis and you're really crappy at it, but then you practice and you practice and you start refining what you do in this situation when you see the ball coming this way, how you should slice, how you should hit. All of this is coming intuitively. But in a strong sense, you're not the same agent that you were when you first started to learn tennis. You have evolved, and part of the evolutionary story is you have evolved perhaps to the point of saying, well, let me sit back and think about my game, not just when I'm doing it, but when I have some leisure time. And now by writing down probabilities of what will happen when I do certain actions, I as an agent have evolved still a little bit more. So the process of writing down a probability, I think, is analogous to the agent evolving into a more able agent than it was previously. I don't know if you guys agree with...
That's very interesting, because one of the stories that we keep on repeating when we are talking about enactive ideas and so on is the story about how you become an expert at something. And the becoming of an expert almost goes in the opposite direction you just said, but it doesn't undermine what you were saying, because I'll tell you why. I mean, normally you're just given lots of rules to begin with. You're learning to drive a car, and you say, well, you have to, this is how you put it into gear. You have to look at the signs, and there's a whole set of rules that you try to follow as rules. It's sort of like, oh, okay, I have to do this. Rule number one, I have to pay attention to this. They're not probabilities. We're not talking about probabilities yet, but it is a form of formalized knowledge, as that you could potentially approach it in probabilistic terms, but it doesn't matter really. As you become better and better at it, you don't think of the rules. They become incorporated. But there's a subtle issue there, because you become better than the rules. You know when to break the rules, when a rule is very, very serious, and when a rule is like, oh no, this conditions is just fine, and I need to do this, follow this rule exactly. Maybe driving the car is not the best example, but at anything, it's like, oh, there's not a problem if I cut this corner, in something else I'm doing, not in driving a car. And so, interestingly, your bodily knowledge becomes better attuned that list of rules that you began with. The reason I don't think,
but that's right. But so you notice that I said the tennis player gets better and better through practice, and then at some point in their leisure time, when they're not on the court, then they start doing these other things, calculations, watching videos, getting a better sense of probabilities, but then to translate that into a better game, they have to somehow incorporate that back into their intuition, because they're not going to be doing the calculations outside of their leisure time.
I agree. So I think that doesn't undermine what you're saying, because it's possible to do what you just said. You know, after you become an expert, you want to maybe reconstruct this bodily knowledge, and then you might be able to give it this expression in terms of possible outcomes, probabilities of this happening, that happening, and potentially
and then you bring it back into your bodily knowledge and forget.
Yes, indeed.
Forget the origin, you know, the analysis that you've done in the background.
It may be that it's not entirely possible to do that. It may be sometimes when you ask an expert about, but how did you notice that this was different from that? And they just don't know how to tell you. Say, well, I just did. You know, a wine taster, you know, experienced wine taster. How did you notice the difference between this vintage and that? It's like they have to invent language in order to try to express the difference. But if you don't really know, and if you don't undergo some experiences, you don't really follow what they say. So it may be that reconstruction may not always be available in all domains. I mean, that doesn't mean it is not there, say, in quantum mechanics.
That's true.
This question of knowledge, I had written down as one possible discussion point. So maybe I'll just throw it out there and you can decide if you want to talk about it or not. But I was thinking about the fact that in quantum mechanics, the knowledge that an observer gets about a system, so if I'm measuring the spin of an electron or something, that piece of knowledge is treated as a proposition. So it's treated as like the electron is spin up, right? And that's the outcome. That's the piece of knowledge that I have after doing this experiment. And then in scenarios like the Wigner's friend thought experiment, where you have multiple observers observing one another, observing the electron, there is this question of how do you take one of those propositions, like my knowledge that the electron is spin up, and pass it around to somebody else without it being changed in the process. And so this is a question of like intersubjectivity or shared knowledge. And it seems like one strategy is just to deny that it's possible to pass it around. And then that sort of leaves observers in their own kind of island universes. But it seems like another strategy is to deny that knowledge is propositional in that way. And the enactive approach tends to do that. So I'm wondering if the enactive understanding of knowledge as non-propositional could be like useful in thinking about what quantum measurement outcomes are.
Yeah. To clarify, knowledge is not propositional doesn't mean that propositions do not exist. They're not useful, they're not there. And one can state things in propositional terms, but there is always a whole set of presuppositions that are sometimes hidden in our idea that we can A, formulate such propositions, and B, listen to them and understand them. And then to assume that what Hanne was saying, for instance, in terms of participation, what we're doing is a constant, you know, pulling and pushing, so to speak. That I may state a proposition, you don't get it. So what do? You just say like, okay, I just go home with this thing I don't understand, or do you ask a question? You ask a question. You negotiate this, and eventually, I may have to do a little demonstration showing you something that happens and so on. Eventually becomes embodied, and you get involved in that demonstration. Say, no, things don't go that way. Evidently, there are ways in which our understanding is always layered on top of embodied forms of participation and understanding. That most of the time when we use language, well, it goes well. It doesn't. But the actual usage of language as linguistic bodies is how we deal with the breakdowns. How do we deal with misunderstanding? That's what language is for, is to deal with misunderstandings of language. We need language to deal with how we sometimes do not really come across clearly in what we want to say. And therefore I had to say, sorry, I didn't mean that, I meant something else. But you said it, and then there's a whole confrontation and possible conflict or interpellation of the other person. It's like, why did you say it if you didn't mean it? All of that has embedded in it all very complex forms of knowing, so to speak. That I know what you mean, that I know what you say, but it doesn't match your expression. That you're saying something, but maybe you mean it ironically, and I have to figure out why. All of that is embodied in non-propositional aspects of the knowledge. So in Bigness Friend, I imagine, I think like you said, Amanda, in one of the talk, that eventually they would just try to figure it out together. What this knowledge will not just be passed on like a packet, but it will be a process that is done together, a participatory process. Normally, at the end of which they will come to some agreement, or not. Or there would be a breakdown, and say like, no, we disagree. We just don't see the same thing the same way, and that's it. But that is the actual process that happens all the time, you know. And that's Hanne was saying, and we are ideally. The important thing to notice is that even if we do this in a very slight way, it's like, oh, I misunderstood what you said. And so there is a little transformation that is happening. If I mention something, having a conversation with somebody, and I mention something and the other person goes silent, I mention a dog. Hey, that's a nice dog. It's like yours, isn't it? And the other person goes quiet. What's going on? Well, my dog died last week, you know. Wow. Okay. Sorry to mention. I didn't want to bring that up. But sorry. What happened? That you've been not just simply informed of something. You have been now reshifted a little bit in this interaction. It's like, okay, I'm not going to mention that again. Maybe I won't mention dogs again, never again to this person, because I will always be remembering this moment. You've been changed. And it's not just simply the propositional aspect that has changed me, it's the whole participatory situation. Mm-hmm. And this is what, the engaged aspect of how we know. And I take what Hanne says about letting be as what would be the ideal way of knowing, which is you want to know the thing in itself, but you have to intervene and interact with that thing and therefore change it. How do you do that? Well, it's a paradox. You have to intervene in such a way that at best from the best way you can tell, you're letting it be, but it may not be the case. You may have to be willing to change by the other thing telling you like, no, that's not it. And so, yeah, that when I read some of the papers about Bigness Friends, I sometimes see a little bit of a cognitivist bias in how these things are discussed. Now, not always, obviously, but I sometimes see that discussions about informations in the brain and things like that, and that becomes a little bit like, well, that's not how we really interact. Even I don't believe scientists interact that way. we are real people. We're embodied agents, and therefore, when we disagree, we decide to either go for a coffee and try to work it out, or we know that then there is a limit to what we agree on, and so on, and that's it, and it's no problem. Or we become mortal enemies. I don't know, but you eventually have to work it out in some way, and it goes beyond the propositional form of knowledge, or rather, it's what's underneath all that propositional form of knowledge. It's already there, you know.
Yeah, I like that way of putting it all. I've accused Amanda in the past of what was it? Overvaluing agreement.
Yeah.
And something like that. And the usual Bigness Friends story is that they have to come to agreement somehow. And I always question, well, why do they have to come to agreement? Oh, because physics says they must. Well, how does physics say they must? I'm sorry, I'm having a conversation with Carlo Robelli right now. He's in the front of my brain. And, I think this overemphasis of agreement misses the point. The more important point is they have the two players, the two agents, eventually will become engaged with each other. Whether they come to agreement or not, if they come to a disagreement, you still know that they were engaged with each other. Either way, you have evidence that they're not in island universes. They're living in the same universe because either they're coming to agreement or they're coming to violent disagreement. So it's not the agreement that is somehow significatory, if that's a word, of being in one world. At least then, during the time of engagement. At other times, I'm willing to believe they are island universes, but it doesn't mean that island universes can't come and merge at times and then tear apart again. Same way, I think, with your microbes that are distinct from their environments for some time, and then that dissolves perhaps, or at least to some extent, and then they can become reconstituted as autonomous individuals again eventually. Other thing is, we just critiquing Amanda. I'm sorry to always pick on you.
No, it's helpful.
You said, I make a measurement and now I know the spin is up. And you're thinking of that as a proposition. And I would say, well, QBism doesn't think of that as a proposition. I don't know the spin is up, because that is implicitly a statement about the object there rather than me. So a QBist would say, I've taken an action on the system. It has led to a certain experience that causes me to believe that if I take the same action, I will get the same experience. But now, if that's a proposition at all, it's a proposition about me, not really, not of it. I'm pointing to it. I think a whole lot of the problem for quantum mechanics and maybe in cognition is that we have to rearrange how we speak of things. That's just a serious part of the problem in getting the ideas across. We need new language because we've got a different way of thinking, for instance, than the standard philosophers of physics on the one hand, and the larger cognitive science. I take it enactivism is a small minority. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, when you bring the agent into such statements about the state of the electron, and then you say, well, I may abbreviate it, and I say that the spin is up, but actually you say, well, translate into all this very much more precise statement about what I did, what happened, and what I believe is the case when I do the next thing. The issue that immediately comes up is the one about ontologies. Like, first of all, I'm an agent and I'm part of this universe too. So is it because I'm able to have these dealings in propositions, in theories, in probability rules, and so on, that I am particularly taking this look on what's going on? How does that relate to what's happening when I am doing these things? Like, how can I speak beyond that? Maybe I can't. But the question is, what underlines that agency? And I think that's the question of ontology. It's like, not just anything happens. That's the thing, that another way to put it, and say, and there are things that seem to be beholden to clear rules, like the normative rules of when you apply probability theory, or the more softer and vague normativity of remaining the agent that you are, the vital norms, the things you care about. So those things are not arbitrary. And yet it does kind of, and I think people may be uncomfortable with a position like a perspective like QBism, because they seem to be you may seem to be saying, we cannot say anything about that underlying ontology. And I wonder what's the case here, because from an enactive perspective, we are confronted with similar issues. We're confronted like when you say, hey, objective, subjective, in the end they meet, there are distinctions, but when you look at it from this perspective, that there is nothing, or this distinction does not guarantee you or allow you to say that one is real and the other is arbitrary. No, that's not the case. As the softness of the sponge is objective and subjective in a sense, because it is realized in that interaction and in that experience. So, but then the question is, what's going on underneath that you might actually, even underneath is a linguistic habit, but I don't mind, and sometimes we can question it too. What's going on is such that can happen. And one of the things where some enactivists have been meeting also together with Buddhist thinking is this idea of groundlessness. This is not my particular case, but in any case, I can see why they're looking for an ontology. In this case, an ontology that there is no firm ground, that things are always in flux, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that we should be able to say a bit more. When you think about it, this has been said for over 2,000 years. Anaximander, said that the world is made of the apeiron, the infinite undefined. Things are always in flux and changing. Or or the other one was Heraclitus about the flat. So there is a intuitive recognition, almost like a sideways glance that we cannot see directly, but we see that something is brewing there. As soon as I put my eye on it, I'm already determining, I'm already doing my cognitive stuff, and I'm already trying to discern things and so on, so I miss it. But it seems that we should be able to say more, and that's what I think that for me is an open question.
I think we should be able to say more.
Okay.
And for me, that is giving a story for why we adopt this set of normative rules when we get really precise about our actions and experiences. So this set would be quantum theory. Why did we adopt this one rather than some other one that I could make up? And to tell the story of, it's because the world is this way, whatever way, it's this way, that I adopted this rather than that, then that's what I mean by an ontology. Yeah. And what is that way? And I don't know, but I think the order of the story is that well, I don't know. I don't know.
I also don't know. Yeah, tough question.
But I think a physicist wouldn't be a physicist if they weren't asking,
yeah.
What is the way of the world?
Mm-hmm.
What is the most fundamental thing that I can maybe not say? Maybe say is the wrong thing, because one often thinks of ontologies as, my colleague Rudiger Schock says I should not use the word ontology for what we're seeking, because people have in mind that when you find an ontology, you're making an ultimate statement. The world is this way. And instead, I'm thinking of the game that we're playing is trying to find an adequate hypothesis that fits quantum theory. As a hypothesis, the world is this way. Is the world truly that way? Well, that's beyond our ability to say, but we can make up a story that makes sense, or the goal is to make up a story that makes sense of why we've adopted this formalism and not that one.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm calling an ontology. And I think it has to do with the character. So that was at the end of the talk, after Amanda's beautiful diagram of the connective tissue. I think we've learned that we need to focus on that. That quantum observers, agents are truly, they have to be engaged, and there's a sense in which there's no strict boundary anymore between the agent and the environment. This is what the paradoxes of quantum theory have pointed us to. And now I want to explain the normative structure. Well, the way to explain the normative structure is to say more about the character of the connective tissue that Amanda was talking about. Can we say something more precise about it? Can we say something more precise about the flesh, if we were to use Merleau-Ponty's terms? Can we say something more precise about Whitehead's actual occasions, if there's similarity between these ideas? And so the game is to say something more precise about that, and of the character of the style. This is the way the world is. For instance, I thought, the way Amanda put it was, there's this little region that we can't draw a distinction, and the size of the region is metered by the size of this number h. I think conceptually that's along the right line. Well, h has a certain value, so that's saying something more precise about how much we can distinguish the agent from the external world. If h were smaller, there would be more a larger distinction between them. If h were larger, there would be a less of a distinction between them. So these are things that are left out of the general philosophies, I think. This idea of how much is, quantify it, how much is the agent engaged with the world? And at least in the precise laboratory of quantum theory, you may be able to quantify that. Now, can you more generally, when we're talking about situations where we don't know what all of the possible outcomes are, we don't have utility functions and so forth, maybe we can't quantify it then. On the other hand, maybe we can. Maybe that is part of the lesson of quantum theory, that at least in the precise laboratory, you could find the minimal space. And maybe then there's hope that you can say something more broadly. Now, when we're talking about cognition, for instance. At least that's my thinking on the fly.
I wondered, you said at some point when talking about John Bell, about that probability one means you will act on this probability, not that there's reality to it. And so I keep thinking about quantum QBism as a manual for behaving in an uncertain world. So one thing that also runs through this is that as you act, as you measure, the next thing will be different. And this is true from different directions. So one person makes a measurement, another person makes a measurement. So then the way the world will be in the next moment is different in different directions. So I think that's also relevant to what we're discussing in a way. So ontology then is made on so how the world is different now than next moment.
That was my reaction. So you just said what I was going to say. Yeah, and this language of something being created. How should we understand it? I do understand it as actually something being created, not as a metaphor for new knowledge or something like this. Something really happened that is new. So
I do too. I mean, that is a crucial piece of QBism, that the world is in continual creation. It's never the same.
So that an
but I don't know that I would want to call that as a change of the ontology. So
No, it's changing.
well, there's some unfinishedness in the act of creation. There's something potentially novel.
you see, the unfinishedness, to go back to what you said about the Buddhists. So I would think the unfinishedness, that general concept, is part of the ontology.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's that it cannot be finished, that it is a statement of the general character of the world, and that's what I would put in the as an element of, or a piece or part of the ontology.
Indeed, yes.
But the actual world as it is now, I wouldn't necessarily put that. I wouldn't call that ontology. Maybe Rudiger Schock is right, and I should never use the word ontology. But the way I'm thinking now, I wouldn't want to put that there.
Okay.
And then there is the tension between what you said about the wave function is egocentric, personal. There's a tension with that and the participatory universe. Right. I mean, yeah, what is happening there?
I don't see why you think there's a tension.
If you make a measurement and that is something you find, and then the other people also do that in a different place, slightly different place, because they can't be doing it at the same time in the same thing, but we're all, so different measurements make change around, like in a kind of around some kind of lab or something. Then the universe, we don't make the universe just me and the universe. We all are doing that. And so if it's purely egocentric, what does that do with the universe continuing being when we're all busy measuring it or making sense of it?
I don't think that it's any different than let me ask you, if you were to gamble right now, if you had to gamble right now, if someone put a gun to your head and said, you've got to make a probability assignment for whether it is snowing or not snowing in Boulder, Colorado, then you say, okay, fine, I've got to make a probability assignment, I'll do it. That's personal to you, the probability assignment you made. It's unlikely to be the same probability assignment that I'm making right now. That just has nothing to do with the world being participatory or not. It just means that probabilities are personal gambling commitments. And in QBism, a quantum state is literally nothing else than a personal gambling commitment.
But the gambling commitment makes a difference. So if you think it's snowing, you will put on your boots or not. Whereas for me,
it makes a difference for your participation, and mine makes a difference for my participation. But it's not in conflict with the idea of a participatory universe. I'm deciding what I'm going to do. For instance, whether I will put my boots on before walking outside, or whether I put my shoes on before walking outside, based on the probabilities. So then I will participate. But then, so basically, it just brings the quantum state into here, along with your desires and your motivations and whatever else you usually think of as personal to you and not shared with anyone else. It's just, I mean, it's just a realization the quantum state's not out there, it's in here. And it's not the quantum state. There's not just one. What, Amanda?
I was trying to get it away from your head and into your body.
Into my body. Okay, so if we are full on Merleau-Ponty now, then and Samuel Totis, it's the body.
Yes.
It's the body. That's good. That's good. That's correcting my English. Thank you, Amanda. Because the way we express these things makes a difference. Yeah, it's in my body because this is part of the apparatus by which I move my muscles then. I
know. Precisely because of that, it may be already shared to some extent by somebody who knows you very well, for instance. What I think it is a question of language. I don't think there's a question of ideas necessarily here. That the word egocentric does seem to be connoting the idea that it's just me and who has this particular assessment. Just because that is exactly what can happen. I can have an assessment and it will be different from yours, and that is actually the important bit. We don't have to. But
I think I agree with that. But remember, I'm quite sure I agree with that because I've already said that only an educated class uses quantum theory.
Exactly.
So already we're part of a community then.
Exactly.
But remember the bit about probability theory, that probability theory is used once we have conceptualized things enough. If we haven't conceptualized them enough, we can't use probability theory. Right. And similarly, if we haven't conceptualized where we are in the world well enough, we can't use quantum theory.
Yes.
But to me, the egotistical value of all of this is once I've isolated all of my considerations to not be broad-based, but now I think of myself as one little element. At that point, it becomes, it's maybe only the froth on the surface of a very deep ocean, but we're only with any use of probability theory or any use of quantum theory, we're only talking about the froth, not the underlying ocean that got us here to begin with. At least I think that would be my defense of my way of
I get it. To me, what would probably clarify the issue would be a situation in which, let's imagine 2 or 3 people are performing an experiment together, like in your images. And let's imagine that they go through the process of preparing, understanding, making the calculations together, and they kind of think like, okay, this is the quantum state. Don't you agree? And say, yeah, I agree. And they already are in sync in some sense. Yeah. And nothing would say like, okay, now they make separate personal assessments about probabilities because they just made that together. And therefore they're already, that there is no barrier to the very idea, it seems to me, that there is no barrier to the very idea that you could be a QBist and at the same time conceive of a situation in which you are with another colleague working together and both of you make the same assessments, make the same calculations and make the measurement, and then you both arrive at the same conclusions about the implications of that measurement. So the important bit to me is that nothing compels everybody to agree. There could be another perspective or another observer that's the, to me, what it makes the strong claim is that not everybody will agree necessarily. But it's not
that is right. Okay. That is right. That is the essential point. There's nothing, Amanda, there's nothing to compel everyone to agree. but it may well be the case that they do.
Yes.
And
okay.
the it's not very refined language, but I would like to say the most refined language in the latest papers have tried to point out that a group of what you might think of as individual agents, if they're in the same laboratory and they are all speaking, then QBism would treat that as a single agent again. So whatever components it is that do have the agreement, we'll call a single agent. For instance, none of you know, probably, maybe Amanda does, of my coexisting personalities in this head. There's one distinct personality that writes, and there's another one who speaks publicly. And I can, on occasion, genuinely separate which one, and I can see which one. Oh, and they also come with they come with different emotions. One is a very bitter and angry person, and the other one is easier going. So I'm quite sure there are multiple personalities in me, but for the purpose of what is the agent in quantum mechanics, I take all of those things together and say, that's the agent. Similarly, in a laboratory with 3 people, like you were saying, if they are all unified and they are all contributing toward what is considered the essential action, then I would call that one agent. And in the latest paper, it sounds like you guys have had a peek at it. I don't know which version. Eventually, I added a little section of Jacques Pinard's example of a volleyball team being synchronized in their actions and knowing intuitively which person steps in and does. I don't know anything about volleyball. But anyway, this was, I think, a nice example of how you might want to consider the team as a whole, as the agent.
This reminds me of a question I had for Hannah, which is like when you were talking about the kind of autonomy that arises when 2 agents are interacting. So like with the corridor dance. And I know you specifically said like it can't destroy the autonomy of the individual participants, but does the larger system meet the enactive definition of an agent? Like, can you talk about the team as an agent in that sense?
It depends what the situation is that you're looking at. Or so, yeah, in some cases the team might be an agent, but not always, I would say. It depends on, yeah, a team can act as one for sure in certain situations and make decisions or regulate the world as a team, regulate its interaction with the world as a team. That might happen, but I don't think it's always the case with the larger system. I mean, a social interaction isn't an agent in that sense. It doesn't follow that kind of normativity that living beings as agents do.
Mm-hmm. Now, I like that fluid definition. So in the case of the team, I think it is fruitful to think of it as a single agent. But if the team now goes to a restaurant for a meal, and so we're not in the context of the game anymore, then you wouldn't want to think of it as a single agent.
Oh, that's true.
This is the difficulty with the reductionist physicist way of, demanding or standard philosophy of physics like Tim Maudlin and Wayne Mervold and guys like this, is they want a clear-cut, hard and fast, always true definition of what means the agent. Yeah. And they want the answer to come as a result of physics. Mm-hmm. And whereas, at least the kind of understanding that QBism is built on is no, this comes first. And then physics is something later. It's not the physics that comes first and defines agency. It's just you have a notion, for instance, like your minimal agent or a more advanced agent, and you say, if this conditions are met, then now we have an agent who's able to practice quantum mechanics and thereafter. But you're not going to find the answer of what makes an agent in quantum mechanics, because it presupposes the agent underneath it.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's
Underneath
also
the user.
a certain confusion that if you're able to state something with lots of precision, you're really capturing the phenomenon. And sometimes the phenomenon is precisely badly captured when you're too precise, because it's just in the nature of this phenomenon to be so fluid. So you have to then find this mesoscopic approach. You say, well, you know, it's a series of relations and conditions rather than this particular biochemical process that must be present, or this particular neural pattern that must be active. It must be this series of and in a way, you're better characterizing what you want to characterize by allowing your language to be describing something more broad and perhaps a bit vaguer, but at the same time fits better the phenomenon. I mean, I find that a lot. That doesn't mean that there could also be bad characterizations. So sometimes it still has to work. It has to be tested. It has to be you have to see whether people agree with it. But you don't have to. I mean, the signature of a good definition or a good approach is not how precise it is. That you can go and then with an apparatus and measure exactly that necessarily.
Yeah. There's a quote, I was going to dig it up quickly, but I can't find it, that I love to use by William James, where he says, he defines what he means by vicious abstractionism. And then he says that it's the great original sin of the, maybe it was materialist mind. And so he gives vicious abstractionism as the notion that you identify something that's crucial to some phenomena, but then you say, now that I have identified this crucial feature of it, it is nothing but that.
Yeah.
And you then forget about all of the significant details that it is that makes it more than that.
Yeah.
I couldn't find the quote, but
yeah. It reminds me of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Whitehead's is trying to make a similar point. It's like you see the abstract idea embodied in just one physical manifestation. Like, okay, your mind is your brain, and the brain activity, nothing else, and that is precisely missing how the more complex and concrete idea of the mind, which is very subtle and relational and so on, cannot be equated with just neural firing. Not to say that that's not important or super important for the mind, but it's just simply that you're just looking for things in the wrong place. And there are concepts like agency that are just complex concepts, that they're not, if you like, basic concepts, but they're made of relations among many other ideas, and that those relations must be in place, and you cannot say that they have a center that is the core of the concept, that is the essence of it. It's more like, sometimes in this case, in our approach, we identify three related criteria, and they're not independent. They end up being connected, but they do not reduce to just one single idea. And you say, this is just this idea. It's more like you have to look at the normativity, the actions, and the self-individuation as processes that are ongoingly affecting each other. And I cannot make it simpler than that, because then I will miss the essence of the idea. I will miss what I'm trying to characterize, and that's how it is. It's not. If you did, I mean, you could fail by being too vague, and you could fail for striving for so much precision that you just the phenomenon disappears. You know, there's this line by Wordsworth, we murder to dissect. You know, you just, if you want to study life, you won't understand it by just killing, but dissecting, you know, corpses. And that's something that's missed if you don't know that you have to adjust to the phenomenon, which is what my understanding of disengaged epistemology. You had to let that be. You had to let life be in order to study life. Otherwise, you're not going to get it if you just study corpses, or if you study just biomolecular reactions. And that's the issue. It's like, well, I guess it's part of the cultural heritage of reductionism that is so strong in the natural sciences.
I think defining is an activity. It's not, the goal shouldn't be, we have now a definition, we have this box, but it's an activity that you do also in interaction with the world. And so the definition has to be such that the world can answer back to you as you investigate it. So trace a phenomenon so that it remains this phenomenon that you recognize out of your interest in it. And through your dialoguing with it, you can keep defining it. And so the definition should be open and have elements to it that allows to do that.
I think that expression, like you have to allow the world to answer back, is very QBist as well.
Or John Wheeler.
Or Wheeler, yeah.
No question, no answer. I caught on, there's a little bit of a similarity between something Ezekiel said and your let it be, Hanne, to Niels Bohr's thinking. So at a certain stage in his life, after he promoted that quantum theory was all about complementarity, and some notion that he made up, that you needed mutually exclusive, you would have to use mutually exclusive terms to describe something, neither of which could be gotten rid of, but couldn't be used at the same time either. Anyway, at a late stage of his life, he started looking for complementarity in everything, not just quantum physics. So complementarity in humor versus accuracy, I think, was, maybe I'm making that one up, but he emphasized that complementary notions had to be used to describe living things, because Amanda probably knows this better than me. I can't quite conjure up the story, but he emphasized, like you said, was it Faulkner who said you murder to dissect, or you
William Wordsworth.
Yeah. Okay, so Bohr had a similar sort of notion that that you cannot be too invasive of a living thing, or you never can give a mechanistic description, because to be able to give a mechanistic description of the living thing, you would have to so disrupt it in order to find the mechanism that it would not be living. I believe that was his idea. So precise description versus living were complementary notions, I think, but I'm not a good enough Bohr scholar to be able to.
I remember probably reading by Wigner himself about life, and that physics could not properly describe life because he was not in the business of describing such a. I'm sorry, I don't remember the title, but I'm almost certain it was Wigner who had a similar point, maybe.
He had an essay titled "The Probability of Existence of the probability of existence of a self-reproducing unit."
Well, okay.
Well, I mean, he probably wrote more broadly, but I know of one paper where he tried to argue that living beings and quantum theory literally contradicted each other. And this paper was really very important to me when I discovered it, because he makes a mistake in the paper that caused him to not discover what we call in quantum information theory the no cloning theorem. He had the perfect opportunity to find it in 1964. So he modeled the process of a living being by one quantum state turning into two copies of the same quantum state. And so this is what John Wheeler called cloning. And as I say, he makes a mistake. He proves that that such processes are very rare. But even his proof is flawed. But he thinks that he's proven that such a process is very rare. And so therefore, quantum mechanics was incompatible with life. But what he didn't prove was that it's not only rare, it's absolutely impossible to do this thing that he wanted to do. And that's just really amazing that he didn't catch that. But also there's a lesson to be learned from it, and that is that he was modeling living things with quantum states, as if their being alive or not was a quantum state, not an observer's degrees of belief. And so he might have caught on, oh, there's a deep rift here, but he didn't. I think it's called the probability of the existence of a self-reproducing unit.
Okay. The one I was referring to is called, I found it, it's called Physics and the Explanation of Life from 1970 in Foundations of Physics.
Oh, okay.
Where he says that, you know, any theory has a focus and neglects many other things, because I'm reading the abstract. It says nuclear physics disregards weak and gravitational interactions, and because planetary theory neglects all but gravitational forces, and so on and so forth. Because you have a focus, and then you have what's relevant for that problem. But he says physics has ignored everything that would allow it to explain life from physics. That's I think is the gist of the. I may be paraphrasing or maybe misremembering it, but it says physics is applicable to inanimate matter. I wonder if because he did that paper that you mentioned in '64, and then probably reached the conclusion that no, it was a mistake. Or
that might well be. That might well be interesting.
Well, thank you all so much for agreeing to do this and having this conversation. And I feel like I've actually learned a lot of things and noticed new connections between the two. So
I find it very, very stimulating. And
I think we ought to make this somehow the beginning of things. We need more engaged interaction between enactivists and QBists.
I agree.
Lately, the phenomenologists have taken an interest in QBism, and so we're talking more. For instance, there's a volume that will come out sometime this year of papers on phenomenology and QBism. But I just the discussions with you guys today, and also seeing what Amanda has presented on enactivism, I think that might be a faster route to progress.
I agree. I think that there's a lot of resonances and stimulating complementarities that when you say something, I want to just say, how would I understand it? And that probably prompts me to try to develop or keep on developing some idea. And I think it's a nice connection there. And I think it would be nice to continue the conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. Amanda, you should be the leader.
Okay, I will wrangle.
the organizer.
I agree.
When you call, I shall come.
Perfect.
Thank you, Amanda, for putting it together.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Amanda.
Thank you guys for agreeing to do it.
Sounds good. All right, bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.